Welcome friends to another r/NuclearRevenge video. Today we've got a crazy story of getting revenge against what was a best friend, then turned bully. But first, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons down below so you never miss any of my daily videos. Our first story of the day is I got revenge against my now ex-best friend. All of this happened in high school when my ex-best friend and I were between the ages of 14 and 17. My most vivid memory from childhood was when my parents used to invite their friends over on the last Sunday of every month for dinner. I remember sneaking out of my bedroom to watch from the top of the stairs when they would eat and laugh together, and thinking about how I would do it with my own friends someday. Unfortunately, my parents got a divorce when I turned 7, and it led to a lot of issues for me, social anxiety being at the very top of the list. Now, if you don't know what social anxiety can do to a person, I'll give you a scenario. Imagine shaking like a leaf when asked a question, even if it's something as simple as your name. I was the shyest person wherever I went, and when people figured that out, they didn't even bother looking my way or speaking to me. As if it wasn't bad enough that I actually walked the school hallways on my own like a pathetic little person, they also started to bully me. It began in middle school when my classmates would make tiny little jabs at me in the hallways and call me weird names. It continued until sophomore year, then they graduated to making fun of me in the cafeteria and pushing me around. I learned my lesson and began to bring my own lunch to school and eat by myself under the bleachers. And it was incredibly peaceful for a few weeks until they found me again. When they saw me, they went out of their way to always corner me and be nasty, laughing when I would shake, quiver, and stutter in fear. One day, one of them got sick of asking me questions and getting no response, so he hit me across the face. I still remember like it happened yesterday when one of the most popular girls in school walked up to my bully and pushed him away, yelling a lot of curse words and causing a scene. Although I was very uncomfortable with the gathering crowd, it was the first time anyone had ever done anything like that for me, and my heart warmed immediately. It was one thing to just tell off someone, but watching her get so enraged at my bully made me think that maybe I would find a friend in her. My ex-bestie and I became good friends very fast, and it was like we complimented each other in the most stereotypical way possible. I was quiet, shy, and good at school, and she was outgoing, fun, and came late to nearly everything. Sooner than I expected, we became super cozy around each other, having sleepovers and dinner at each other's homes. Our mothers even started mingling more with each other. I loved having a best friend so much because it meant that I could do all the things I'd fantasized about from childhood. The sleepovers, sharing secrets, and giggling about boys. And I was determined to make sure that I was the best friend that anyone could ever ask for. Unfortunately, my obsession with the friendship that she and I shared made me completely blind to the fact that she never returned a lot of my sentiments. For example, she would barely speak to me during school hours, but then during lunch, she would pull me to a table with her popular friends and make me talk about things that I normally would only tell her. It was very discomforting for me, but I did whatever I could to make sure that she didn't get upset with me. I kept on telling myself that whatever things she put me through were the same things that every other pair of best friends went through. After all, I'd never had friends before, so how was I supposed to know? My ex-best friend and I were best friends from sophomore year until junior year, which was when things started to get really bad. I was used to having her as my utmost priority and being the last thing she thought of, and I'd worked out a good dynamic to make sure that I was exactly the person she needed me to be. Her servant, while also showing up to my classes early and participating in the few clubs I'd been courageous enough to join. It was a little stressful to combine, but I tried hard enough to keep my head above water and be there for her enough so we didn't fight. As we moved closer to senior year, I started to take school a little more seriously because I needed to get a scholarship, and I didn't want anything ruining that one plan for me. My ex-best friend did not like that at all because it meant that I wouldn't be able to be her little tag-along anymore. She tried to guilt-trip me into showing up to parties with her and entertaining her friends during lunch, and I refused every time she asked because I always had something to do. It caused a huge rift between us, and no matter how much I tried to apologize and make out time for us to hang out alone and do something that didn't include any of her other friends, we moved further apart. It hurt me a lot because she was supposed to be my best friend and support me in things I did. And even though I was used to being put last in the relationship, things had started to get to me. Our relationship remained strained, and it even got worse when I started to casually go out with the one boy that finally noticed me. He was cute, charming, and also a member of the chess club like me, so we had things in common and got along pretty well. My relationship with my new boyfriend felt a lot less draining than being around my best friend, and I started to learn what being respected really felt like. Still, I was desperate to save my friendship with a popular girl, so I decided to host a sleepover with her where we would talk about what had been going on in our lives, and then I would break the news about my relationship to her. It was the perfect plan, and so I got to work making all of her favorite snacks and picking out movies I knew she'd like. The day of the sleepover reached, and my best friend was nowhere to be found. She refused to answer any of my calls or texts, and I got really worried. I stayed up till it was really late, waiting for at least a message from her to say that she was safe, but I didn't get anything. It was nearly midnight when I realized that she probably wasn't coming, and decided to clean up and get ready for bed. To stop myself from crying, I went on Instagram where I saw countless videos and pictures taken from her parents' house where she apparently threw a party. I didn't realize when I started crying until I couldn't see the pictures on my phone clearly anymore. I sobbed until there were no tears to cry anymore, and I eventually fell asleep. My boyfriend was very sweet and understanding about things, but I noticed that he kept defending her. It pissed me off, but I wasn't ready to fight with the only other friend that I had. So I took his suggestion and went to speak to her. When she spotted me, she feigned sadness, immediately going into a long winding story about how she had forgotten about the party and people had showed up to her house before she could make it out. She mentioned trying to leave, but realizing that she had to keep the house safe so that no one broke anything. The story seemed a little weird, because I knew that she didn't joke with her parties, but before I could point anything out, she had already started to shed tears. I believed her because it seemed like she really missed me, and we hugged and made up. She was really sweet to me for the rest of the week, and even set up another sleepover by herself. I was really excited for the sleepover, and we did all the stereotypical best friend sleepover things. By the time I'd eaten dinner and dessert, I was tired enough to fall asleep. That was my first mistake, leaving her wide awake and unsupervised in my room. The school year's end reached and we had to write exams. I tried to study with my boyfriend and best friend, but they made things a little slower for me, so I mainly studied on my own. The Friday before the week exams were supposed to begin, my ex-best friend called me into an empty classroom and locked the door behind us. She told me the exam papers had been delivered to a teacher and that she needed help getting just one of them. I immediately refused to help, letting her know that we could face serious penalties if we were even heard talking about it. She called me a prude and a few other very colorful names, but I still wasn't letting up. She then tried to coerce me softly, telling me how all the cool kids in school would want to be my friends and how they would forever be indebted to me. That almost got to me because she was using my own fear against me, but I stood my ground, firmly telling her no. She got upset and told me that I had just passed up the opportunity to make some more cool friends for myself and that I would regret it. We didn't speak to each other for a while after that. On the final day of exams, I got called into the principal's office and accused of leaking exam questions to my classmates, the very thing I'd been against doing in the first place. I tried to argue my case, but there was very little I could say when there was a suspicious amount of eyewitnesses confessing to having seen me. I had a good idea who pulled the elaborate stunt, but I forced myself not to think about it. As a punishment, I was banned from all the school events that were going to take place, and I had to do community service during the first month of summer school. Both my parents hosted an intervention for me, and after failing to get me to admit that I leaked the exam questions, they concluded that I was getting out of control and decided that they would ground me for the entire month as well. So I wasn't doing very well. I spent the entire month by myself with minimal contact with the outside world. But not once did my boyfriend or my best friend even call me or try to visit. The month passed soon enough, and I decided that I would confront my best friend about knowing that she lied against me. Coincidentally, she invited me to one of her summer parties, and I thought it would be the best opportunity. From the second I entered into her parents' large mansion, I had a really bad feeling in my gut, so I would try to be quick. I thought I was paranoid until I walked into my best friend and my boyfriend kissing on the stairs. It broke my heart, and I made to run away, but they spotted me. I wanted to go straight home and cry my eyes out, but they had other plans. They, alongside their other friends, cornered me right in the middle of the party. They that was supposed to be my best friend, and the boy that had told me he loved me about a month and a half ago, started to laugh and point fingers at me. Someone turned on a projector against the wall, and a montage started to play. Images of me doing a lot of different and embarrassing things, like putting on my retainers at night, just coming out of the bathroom half clothed, and a lot of other things I would rather not mention, played on a wall, and I watched in pure horror. These were things that only my best friend and boyfriend could have gotten access to. There were pages from my diary as well, edited to say very incriminating things about people that I barely even know. I left the party shaking in anger and hurt, unable to understand my bad luck in choosing friends, but swearing to get these people back. I got a job and spent the rest of my summer either working or cooped up inside my house making my own plans. They forgot that being a quiet person meant that I saw and heard everything that went on around me, and my whole plan was to use that against them. After all, the best way to fight fire is with fire. When school was back in session, I went back as if nothing happened, becoming my quiet, loner self again. But this time, I was a loner with a mission. It was our senior year, and I wanted to begin with a bang. I started by submitting a footage of my ex-best friend changing her grades in the school computer that I intercepted from the tech club in school, and then alerting teachers every time that I spotted her and my ex-boyfriend together in the janitor's closet or an empty classroom. I also ratted their friends out one after the other, making sure that everything they had ever done in the dark came to light. By the end of the school year, my ex-best friend had been caught cheating during tests and exams so many times that she would either have to go back to junior year again or leave the school. Her parents had money, so of course they fixed it by changing schools, but most of her information was already out on the internet on an anonymous blog, so she would be very popular at whatever school she ended up going to. It's been a few years since I left high school, and I still don't feel bad about what I did to her. Instead, I look back and laugh about it because she deserved every single thing, and then some. I don't know much about how she's doing now, but I know that if she ever meets me again, she'll regret knowing me. This story kind of makes me think about how I felt sometimes growing up with friends. I had friends who were way more popular than I ever was, and sometimes I found myself thinking to myself, are they just friends with me out of pity? Do they just find it funny to hang around me, talk to me? Have you guys ever had like an internal monologue worrying about whether your friends or maybe your partner in a relationship actually have genuine feelings for you? Let me know about you guys in the comments down below. And our final story of the day is Trouble in Paradise. I'm the second child in a family of 3, and my 2 other siblings are boys. We each have 2 years separating us, which means that we're very close in age. My little brother is the sweetest person ever. Super kind and thoughtful, and we're basically glued at the hip. So close that everyone thinks we're twins. My older brother is a jerk and has been since we were little children. He always liked to bully us and get us in trouble every chance that he had, unrelenting with terrorism no matter how much we begged. My theory was that he was very jealous of the relationship I and our little brother had, but he had too much pride to actually tell us that he wanted to be a part of all the things we did together. Instead, he decided he would be a nuisance and ruin whatever fun we had managed to create for ourselves. He didn't realize that he had slowly started to make us hate him, and by the time we were all adults, we didn't care for him much. It was especially annoying as our parents were very busy people who could not afford a babysitter, and they often left him in charge of us on a lot of weeknights. He took complete advantage of the little power he had, using whatever chances he had to separate and bully me and our little brother. I tried to stand in and fight when I could, but coming from a typical Korean immigrant family meant that I had to show respect to everyone older than me, no matter how irritating they were. We did try to report him to our parents, but when there was so much work to be done and money to be made, they told us that they didn't need the extra trouble. Plus, he was their golden child and it was his word over ours. Knowing that he wouldn't be listened to was a good way to get us to work on dealing with the situation ourselves, and completely staying out of his way. When we got old enough, we took on afternoon jobs at the mall and spent nearly all of our time there. With no siblings in his way to pick on, my brother took his mean streak with him to school and became a tyrant, teasing the kids and even some teachers. He's really smart and got most of the good-looking genes, so it was a no-brainer that he was the favorite of a lot of people. My little brother and I grew up in his shadow, but we had each other, so it didn't matter much to us. Another thing about my big brother that he was well known for was breaking hearts. He knew that he was really good looking, so girls flocked to him like little birds, and he made sure to go through entire flocks. He once dated a whole group of friends and made them promise to be nice to each other. It was wild, but I never expected less of him. He was capable of getting away with everything, no matter how insane. Fortunately for him, he didn't peak in high school and then fall off completely like a lot of his friends who messed around with him in high school. He played football in high school, so he got a sports scholarship and went on to study chemical engineering at an Ivy League university, and it didn't take long for his reputation to precede him. He became the star quarterback and got what seemed like the entire cheerleading squad in college, and he was praised for it. Everyone knew who he was, and he was having the time of his life, being known and respected as that. After college, my older brother went off to the corporate world of New York to make a name for himself, while my little brother and I stayed back to finish community college and work a little closer to home. After 2 years in New York, our father passed away, and our older brother had to come back home for the funeral. He showed up, and my mother went from a mourning woman to a doting mom, cooking everything he asked for at the drop of a hat and treating him the same way she and my father used to when he was still living at home. I guess he enjoyed the attention a little too much because, after our father's funeral, he decided to take on remote work and move back home. I and our second brother thought it wouldn't be so bad because there was a chance he'd matured into a sensible person. But we were so wrong. He seems to have regressed, playing pranks like he never left high school, graduating to even hitting us as a joke. He never took responsibility for anything, messed the entire house up, and always talked loudly to his friends about what girls he's currently sleeping with. As usual, both the younger siblings were made to go through it until they could properly adjust. We hoped that something would change soon, but we weren't prepared for how much we would enjoy it. As kids, our parents were friends with another family, and they had dinner at each other's homes whenever any of the adults could spare the time. The couple had just one daughter, we'll call her Goth Girl, and she and I became pretty good friends, considering she was an only child and I was the only girl in my family. We didn't have much in common, but we managed to put that aside and have fun together anyway. The name Goth Girl is pretty self-explanatory because she was always wearing dark-colored clothes, listened to mostly metal alternative music, and had an array of ear piercings. From the day our parents introduced us to each other till adulthood, I'd seen her wear light colors barely even a handful of times. She had a very intense and intimidating aura that only went away when she was with me because we were basically best friends, and she could be completely herself with me. For some reason, she was the only girl that my older brother hadn't dared approach. He barely even spoke to her, and if he had to, he stuttered so badly that he would just give up. It was pretty obvious to everyone that he liked her, but my brother would rather run and hide than speak to her. It was hilarious to watch, knowing the kind of person he was, and seeing that their personalities were so different. I was convinced that nothing could ever happen between that. But I was so surprised to come home from work one day to find Goth Girl and my older brother half naked and tangled up on the couch. It was hilarious, and I made sure to tease them about it every chance I got. It was a confusing dynamic. My sweet, artsy, dark friend who hid her nice nature from the world with a resting witch face and dark lipstick, dating my misogynistic jerk of a brother. But it was a very interesting one nevertheless. I tried to talk her out of it, but she assured me that she knew what she was doing. I knew there would be a change in my big brother, but I just didn't think it would be so soon or so dramatic. He went from an annoying, brash jerk to a moderately well-behaved person whenever Goth Girl was around. He seemed to be completely smitten and did everything that she asked of him, which included purposely being nice to his family and doing things for our mother instead of having her do things for him. Even our mother noticed the change in her favorite son, and she appreciated it. Goth Girl was a person with a very strong personality, and so was my brother. At first, it was really cute watching them bicker over small things, and then he would give in to whatever request she had. But with time, the fight started to become more serious. Big Brother must have gotten sick of trying to do right by his girlfriend all the time, so he attempted to begin treating her the same way he treated all the girls he dated before, which was his first mistake. I attempted to warn him because I knew that it would not end well, but he asked me to mind my own business and stay out of things that concerned him, so I did. My older brother started to cheat on his girlfriend with one of his many exes from high school, and almost immediately Goth Girl found out. She came over to the house and they had a big fight about it, but she didn't break up with him as expected. Instead, they fixed the situation and were good again for a while. Until my brother would be his usual self and relapse into cheating. The relationship became really toxic after barely a year of them being together, and everyone wondered why she didn't just up and leave him. I asked her, and she informed me that she intended to teach my brother a lesson that he would never forget. She expected me to be protective of him and ask her questions, but I just nodded. My brother was the biggest jerk I knew. Whatever she would do to him, I knew that he deserved it. My little brother's college graduation soon came up, and I decided to gift him with a trip for 2 to LA for a week. He chose me as his +1, and I was really excited. Somehow, Goth Girl got some information about my plans, and she also booked a getaway for her and my older brother to the same place. I mean, down to the hotel even. It pissed me off because I wanted my little brother to have a good time, and with our older brother there, it seemed actually impossible. When I brought it up, she promised me that we would barely even hear a peep from them. True to her word, my little brother and I actually had a good week, and when it was time to catch the flight back home, Goth Girl emerged with a huge rock on her ring finger and a glowing grin. My brother had proposed. It was a huge shock factor for my little brother and me, and then everyone else, seeing this couple that we had seen fight all the time now engaged and excited to be married. They even started acting like a new couple again, being all romantic to each other. 2 months later, Goth Girl dropped a bomb on us. She was pregnant. The wedding immediately started being planned, and it felt like things were moving too fast. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, but I'd been told once already by my brother to mind my business when it came to his life. So I did just that. They planned a whole wedding and executed it successfully in less than a month, and my brother seemed very happy with the arrangement. He allowed Goth Girl to do whatever she wanted, becoming the stereotypical husband figure and seemingly maturing in the span of only a couple of months. After the wedding had taken place in the spring, they moved to New York together and stayed there for a couple of months, and had zero contact with us back home. That was until late on a chilly autumn evening in November when my brother called, drunkenly yelling that Goth Girl had kicked him out of their shared apartment. There seemed to be trouble in paradise, but I was unable to reach anyone properly until the next couple of days. My brother seemed miserable, talking about how Goth Girl had started to treat him badly. From his explanation though, we figured out that he was just upset that the honeymoon phase was over, and his wife was only being mean to him because he was being irresponsible and had started cheating again. When he realized that I wouldn't be on his side, he tried to get our mother involved, and she was quick to respond to him, hopping on the first flight she could find to New York. She returned home with her tail tucked between her legs 2 days later, and although she never said what actually happened, I felt very proud that someone finally stood up to her. My older brother's marriage fell apart pretty soon after we found out that Goth Girl was never pregnant. By then, she'd gotten complete access and control of all of his accounts, so she emptied his bank accounts whenever she pleased. He tried really hard to get her to hand over his possessions, and when she didn't, he filed for divorce. It seems a little mean and maybe even heartless of us, but the entire time we were present in the court, my little brother and I rooted for Goth Girl. We knew that she was exaggerating a lot of the things she said, but she had a lot of evidence that incriminated our brother, and he had no way of getting himself out of it. She ended up winning the case, taking a huge amount of money, as well as a spousal allowance for the next 5 years. Goth Girl and I got even closer after the divorce, and I felt very satisfied with the treatment she gave my brother. He was a terror to us growing up, and I knew that I'd never have it in me to take revenge. So, she did two people a very big favor. Goth Girl went the good old gold digger route. They did the long con. How much do you want to bet that the moment they got involved, this was always going to be their exit plan? They saw some big shot that had a nice job working remotely, making some decent cash, and they said, I want to walk away with half of that. And some is giving my boss a taste of his own medicine. My boss was the complete package when it came to horrible bosses. He was stupid, lazy, selfish, condescending, uncaring, out of touch, and ambitious. I worked for a large enterprise management solutions company in their payroll section. I specifically dealt with handling queries for our high-end customers and training new consultants. I also handled challenging queries that our low and mid-tier consultants couldn't solve. I'm not a computer genius or an IT savant. I know how to do two things: read and search. When I started out as a consultant guy, the guy who trained me said this: if you know how to read, you'll succeed in this job. I believed him, and I came across a problem that wasn't covered in our training. I followed the query line back to its source, searched the database for the solution, and implemented it. That is literally what got me promoted to a senior consultant position in 2 years. A year later, I was dealing with our premium client accounts and handling training. The guy who trained me quit without saying a word, and at the time I didn't understand why. It didn't take long before I was also ready to quit, but I stuck it out because I needed the job. The problem with working in a big company is that everything is compartmentalized. So when something goes wrong, it can take a while for a request to work its way through the chain and then come back with a solution. This was especially true when it came to in-house IT problems. If something goes wrong with a client system on payday, and at the same time we have an issue with our internet, phone lines, or computers, we were screwed. In the few times that it did happen when I was a consultant, I jumped in with my little IT knowledge and helped patch things until the work was done, and then got out of the way when IT arrived. When the pandemic hit, we were one of the first companies to start working from home. This meant that a lot of people suddenly had to take care of their IT problems themselves. My boss was one of those people. Ever since he learned that I have some minor experience in working with computers, he stopped calling IT altogether when his internet or system wasn't working. He called me. So at the start of us working for him, he had me come to his house to set up his Wi-Fi and workstation. When I suggested that he ask the company IT crew to do it, he said they'd take too long and we can't keep our premium clients waiting. I had to catch a bus and an Uber to get to his house. When I gave him the receipts to reimburse me, he told me to file it with the accounts department as an expense. So I did. They told me that I wasn't eligible to receive the reimbursement because it wasn't an expense related to my job. After arguing with HR for 3 weeks, they eventually took it out of the department's budget. My boss was furious with me even after I explained that it was actually his expense. He said that I shouldn't be so petty about such little money. Now, he had found a soulmate in his wife because she was him in a cheap weave and bad makeup. Their house was outside of town in the really nice suburbs, which is why I needed to take a bus and an Uber. They had really weird tastes. Their house and cars were expensive, but their electronics and furniture were cheap. Their clothes and jewelry were knockoffs, but their booze was top shelf. What didn't make sense was they were actually loaded, so they didn't need to skimp on things the way they did. He was making a very goodly amount of money from being the department head of consultants, and she made more than he did. She kept telling me, while I was installing his systems, that the reason I was doing the kind of work I had for the little money I was getting was because I was lazy and didn't go to college. She went on about how she went to a top-class school and worked hard, which is why she had a job at a very impressive company. I knew she was probably telling the truth about her salary because her company was one of our premium clients. And I've seen their payroll. Their people were getting paid. But money doesn't buy common sense because these people didn't even know how to set up their own Wi-Fi. I had to create their router's name and password after having set up everything else for him to work from home. He even had his email, username, and password written on a sticky note that he pasted on his screen. Honestly, I wasn't sure if not going into the office was going to be a good thing or a bad thing, because as incompetent as he was in the office, I didn't know if him not being around would make things worse. There was an incident before all this started when the government declared that there would be an extra public holiday the following week. This is a payroll nightmare. Payroll systems are designed to be robust so that clients can't just change things on their end and accidentally wipe out their entire database. So if something like a public holiday is declared and it wasn't scheduled into the system at the beginning of the new year, or at the very least the start of the new month, it creates problems. There's a whole heap of things that must be adjusted, like minimum weekly hours, taxes, work days for the year, and a bunch of other things. We can't just add an extra vacation day because that would mess up other things as well. So we had to go through every client account and manually change their calendars to count that day as a public holiday, and then manually adjust all their other metrics so that it wouldn't take people's vacation days or log them as absent without leave and then deduct a full day's pay at the end of the month. It was a week from heck. We had to stay late to get through all the client accounts before the public holiday. It was all hands on deck. Even my boss, who was out of the office 2 hours before we clocked out, couldn't hide and had to stay late with us. People were stressed, things were tense, and we were living off of coffee for those 6 days. On the second to last day, we were still not done, and people were starting to get sloppy because they were tired and worn out. Mistakes were being made and fixing them took time, which meant we were falling behind and everyone was starting to get on edge. My boss didn't help matters by exploding every time someone made a mistake or didn't complete their assigned client by his arbitrary deadlines, and then it happened. It was around 9 p.m. when one of the girls in the office, who was of a more timid nature, went to make a fresh pot of coffee. She was having a tough time, and my boss was taking his frustration out on her a lot. She was shaking so badly when she tried to make the coffee that she dropped the pot and it shattered at her feet. The sound of breaking glass gave her such a fright that she tried to run away, but slipped on the wet floor and sliced open her arm on the broken shards. This is where things get wild. My boss refused to allow her to leave to go to the hospital. He said it was her own clumsiness that caused her to get hurt, and that her going to the hospital would just delay things further. I'll confess that I wasn't one of the brave men who stood up to him that night, but a few of the guys were ready to send him to the hospital if he got in their way trying to take her to the hospital. The man saw wisdom and backed down. 3 people left to go to the hospital: the girl herself, her friend, and one of the guys who drove them there. We were now down 3 people and still behind schedule. I pretty much slept in that office those last 36 hours to get everything done on time. And what did we get in return? A "well done, team," while the boss got a performance bonus. This was the beginning of the end for our department. People were not happy as it were, and while the public holiday incident was bad, working from home sent them over the edge. When a query comes into a consultant's terminal, the system starts tracking what they do, how long they take to solve the ticket, and a bunch of other metrics. If they can't handle it, they must request the query to be transferred to a senior. The system then removes the ticket from them and puts it in the section leader's inbox. The system logs this as a failure on the part of the consultant who sent it up the chain. When we were still in the office, if someone had a difficult query, they'd either ask the person next to them for help or even the section leader. Whoever helped them would walk them through it in their terminal, so it's still counted as their successful query. We did this for morale as well as training, because once you see how it's done, you gain experience and you keep your job. Obviously, if people try to game it and be lazy, we just left them to drown. Once we started working from home, we couldn't do that anymore, so section leaders requested the login details of their team so they could log in live to the other person's terminal and help them out. When my boss found out that that's what we're doing, he requested everyone's login details from IT and started spying on us while we worked. The senior consultants got sick of his attitude and behavior, as well as his poor management of the department. They started quitting. I ended up being the one who processed them all out. The reason was that my boss didn't know the procedure for when someone leaves the department. Even though it wasn't my job, I had to look up what needed to happen so that nothing fell through the cracks. I had to get people's laptops and screens that they set up in their homes, which then had to be processed by IT. I had to fill out access revocation forms so that IT could remove their login privileges from the remote network. I also needed to inform HR so that they could do the last day calculations and inform the state how the person's employment ended. If you quit as opposed to being fired, you can't claim unemployment from the state, and a lot of people didn't know that. So when they came back to us to complain, my boss sent them to me and all I could do was refer them to HR. That didn't mean that I didn't have people swearing and crying in my office 6 weeks after they quit because they couldn't buy food. Of course, with more and more people quitting, we weren't able to handle all the client queries, and that meant we needed to move people up from the lower tier consulting floors to help handle the load. And since the lower tiers were losing people, they had to do a recruitment drive, which meant that I had to do more training. But because the guys were pulled up to the premium client level too soon, they didn't have enough experience, so I had even more internal queries to deal with from my own people. At this point, it was my job to train new employees, train old employees, process people out who quit, handle internal queries, and handle external queries. But that was just the beginning of my woes. One premium tier consultant is worth 3 or 4 mid or lower tier consultants. The reason is that at the lower tiers, they can do the work of 3 or 4 mid or lower tier consultants. In the time it takes a mid-tier consultant to handle one case, they could handle 3 or 4 such cases. So at the lower tiers, these top tier guys could handle 15 to 20 cases a day. And then with the premium clients, they'd handle 4 or 5 a day because those cases were more complicated. When the lower tier consultants were brought up from their 4 or 5 mid-tier cases a day to the top tier, they were only managing 1 or 2 a day. So for us to handle the workload of the premium clients, we almost had to strip the mid-tier bare. That meant that we had to recruit an almost entirely new department of rookies. My boss said no. To recruit that many people would destroy his budget, and bye-bye performance bonus. Because he was sitting at home, he didn't see how bad the situation was. We basically had to fill the positions with 1/3 of what we needed. So what did that mean? Any query that couldn't be handled within 30 minutes was sent up to the team leader. If they couldn't solve it quickly, it went up to the next consulting tier, and so on until it landed in my inbox. And it was right around this time when my boss decided to make my life miserable. Part of his job was to sit in on meetings with potential new premium clients. Because the CEO wanted the client to see who the people were that would be handling their payroll, my boss's role was to assure the client of the type of support they would receive. The problem was that the payroll systems that also ensure statutory compliance are constantly updated and changed. So if you're not working with the system on a regular basis, you get left behind on what it can and can't do. Since he hadn't worked on any queries in years, he had no idea what we could and couldn't do on support anymore. He started making promises to clients about support services we either didn't provide anymore or simply weren't possible on our system. One of these promises involved telling a client that they could instantly access their historic payroll data on their end. We'd not been doing that for almost a year. While I didn't agree with it, the development team decided that in order to make the software boot and run faster, the previous month's payroll data would be automatically wiped and placed in an off-network archive. This didn't mean that the data was irretrievable, it was just a tedious process of getting it back. The new client went ahead and signed a contract, and we began the process of changing them over to our system. This means installing the software on their systems and training their staff in HR on how to use the software. In a company their size, this process usually takes about 2 weeks to get all the computers updated and all the staff trained in how to log their hours, leave, disbursements, etc. Everything went well and all looked good until the second week of the month came. The biggest part of why this company chose to go with us was because we promised them that our system allows them instant access to past payroll on their end. The reason they needed it was because they had employees who worked on sites that didn't have internet, fax, or printing facilities, but were generating disbursements on site. So whenever they came back to the office 2 or 3 weeks later, they'd scan all their receipts and then claim the expenses back. But if they generated the expense in the 3rd or 4th week of the month, they'd usually only make the claim in the 2nd or 3rd week of the next month. But for tax purposes, the expense and benefit was accrued in the previous month and had to be logged then, even though the cash payment was made in the next month. You can imagine my confusion when this query popped up on my screen. I spent nearly 2 hours on the phone speaking to everyone, from the payroll person to the CEO, explaining that what they wanted to do was not possible, and the only way to get what they wanted was to retrieve it from the archive. Eventually, it came out that my boss told them that they would have instant access. When I brought this up with him, he first denied that he said that, until they produced the meeting minutes, and then he said it was my fault. Apparently, I told him that we still provide that service, and he went on my word and told the client. That was the last straw for me, and I started keeping a record of the things he was doing and had done before. So now, on the first of every month, I had to do an archive retrieval and then update the client's payroll database. It was bad enough that it was a tedious process, but what made it worse was that you could only retrieve 1 month at a time. So on a third month, I had to do 2 retrievals and updates, on the 4th, 3, and on the 5th, 4, and so on. After 6 months, the issue the devs were trying to avoid was wreaking havoc on the client's systems. 6 months of payroll data stored locally on the client system was slowing it down to Internet Explorer speeds. The client fired us. My boss got chewed out by the CEO, and all that crap rolled downhill onto my head. I had been waiting for this day. The moment our virtual meeting started, I started a screen capture recording. I went through the entire list of things he'd done since I started working with him, and how the state of the department was entirely his fault, along with the loss of the premium client. He started telling me how someone like me could never understand the responsibilities of leadership because I was uneducated, and that this was the highest I'll ever rise in life, and that my ungratefulness and lack of respect cost me my job, because he was going to get me fired first thing in the morning. That was all I needed to hear. I said, "In that case, this meeting is over." I shut down the meeting, logged out of my terminal, saved the recording, turned off my laptop, and waited. A few hours later, I left my apartment to catch a bus. I paid cash for the bus and got off where I caught my Uber the last time I went to my boss's house. This time, I didn't call an Uber, I walked. It took me almost 2 hours to get there, and it was freezing outside. It was near midnight when I got there, so the street was empty. I saw that both of their cars were in the driveway, so I knew they were home. I crept into his backyard and sat down near the wall where I installed the Wi-Fi router. I took out my laptop and logged into my terminal through their Wi-Fi. Now here is something most of you won't know about payroll consultants. We can change your salaries from our terminals. That's right. As long as a company uses our software, any consultant with the right privileges can change anyone's salary. And of course, we would use our own product, so I accessed our employees' salaries through my terminal and tripled my salary for that month. Once it was done, I shut down my laptop, sneaked out, and began my long journey home. It was almost dawn when I got home, and work started in 3 hours, but I took a nap because I wanted to be somewhat alert for what I knew was going to be a rough day. First thing I did when I woke up was tell HR that my boss said he was going to get me fired. HR said that my boss had already filed a complaint for insubordination the previous day, and that if I wanted to file a complaint, I was welcome to do so. Because of all of the out-processing of the other employees I'd been doing, I familiarized myself quite well with the company's disciplinary procedure. I knew that if I filed a separate complaint, I wouldn't be allowed to bring up anything in his complaint against me from my own complaint. So I waited for them to serve me with the notice for a disciplinary hearing, and then I filed a counter-complaint. The counter-complaint had all the evidence I'd put together against him. Everything from the public holiday incident, the snooping on employees, and the snafu with the premium client. This process took a few weeks of pushing papers back and forth before an actual hearing was scheduled. In the meantime, my salary was paid out. I, being a good employee, immediately ran to HR to tell them there was a mistake and asked them how I could refund the extra money that was paid to me. I kicked a hornet's nest that day because everyone was running around trying to figure out how this happened. Eventually, they did an IT audit and it came back to my username and login. So it was clear that I was the one who increased my own salary. This was rolled into my ongoing disciplinary hearing, which now became one of insubordination and theft. An outside attorney chaired the hearing, and the HR manager represented the company against me. During the hearing, the audit was used as evidence against me, and I, of course, denied it, saying that it doesn't make sense for me to increase my salary, only to turn myself in. HR argued that I had a change of heart, and tried to make it seem like I was innocent by reporting it first. When the IT manager had to testify about how he compiled the report and the evidence in the report, that's when I pulled my rabbit from the hat. I asked him how he knew it was me, and he said because my username and password were used to access the terminal. I then asked if I was the only one who had access to my username and password. He, of course, said no, because he was the one who gave my boss the list of everyone's username and password. My next question was, how do we know it wasn't him who logged into my account to change my salary? He sat there for a few seconds and then pulled out his laptop. After about 5 minutes, he turned the screen around and said, "It wasn't me." On the screen were all of the logins into my terminal, and while most of them came from the same IP address, a few a week came from a different address. He then changed the screen to show that the IP address in question logged into multiple terminals every week. But the first terminal it logged into and most frequently used was my boss's. And this is where I made my case. I argued that in his attempt to fire me, he tried to frame me by increasing my salary through my terminal, knowing that I would get caught, because he was afraid that I was going to expose his incompetence, especially after he lost a big client for the company. Everything he said to try and make himself look innocent only made him look more guilty. The chairperson dismissed the case against me and found that my boss was constructively trying to get me to quit, as he had done with other employees. The company then filed a case against him for fraud, and he was found guilty and fired. I was promoted into his position, and immediately I reached out to the other consultants who had quit to try and save the department. Some of them got new jobs and others were glad to come back, knowing that the old boss was gone. The young lady who was cut couldn't face working in an office again, even though that other guy wasn't around anymore. I wish I would have done more to stand up for her, but all I can do now is help the ones in front of me. Personally, I feel like this goes without saying, but do you think OP was just a little bit insane? Going to the length of sneaking to their boss's house, logging into their terminal there, changing their salary, and then claiming that it was the boss trying to frame OP? Do you think OP is extremely lucky this didn't backfire on them somehow? Let me know down in the comments. Is the big audition. 2 years ago, my roommate of 2 years told me he was moving out. It was expected since he had just gotten engaged to his high school sweetheart, and I knew they would want to move in together to a bigger place. I was excited for them, but super bummed about him leaving. He was the best roommate ever and was almost like my brother. We had so much fun living together. Before he moved out, I posted on a site that I was looking for a roommate. I wanted to carefully choose a roommate as I've read so many stories about bad roommates, and I didn't want any drama. I wanted someone like my former roommate, very respectful of my privacy and caring at the same time. He took ensuring the apartment was safe very seriously and was clean to a fault. I especially liked that he took security measures very seriously. You see, back in college, my roommates and I were robbed by a guy one of us had brought home from a party. The robber had a gun to my head and made me lie on the floor, my face to the ground. The three of us were traumatized by the incident and went home for a while. I've been extra anxious ever since. It's been getting better though, but I still get pretty anxious about having strangers in my home. When I told my former roommate about my experience, he was quite understanding about my plight, and he promised to never bring in anyone who would compromise the safety of our home. I got many responses, interviewed 4 people, and was very satisfied with one. She had just graduated college and had parents who were going to pay her rent for a year until she found her feet, and had also just been offered a job in my city, so it all made sense. All was going according to plan until she called to say that she had gotten a better apartment and offer. I was very disappointed, tired, and uninterested in going through the tedious process of interviewing people all over again. At the time, my guy roommate had moved out. I spoke to the person who I preferred after her, and she had also gotten another offer. I was left with another person whom I'd interviewed too. She works as a waitress at a restaurant and was also an actress. She was working as a waitress while waiting for her big break in Hollywood. She excitedly decided she would be my roommate. We met later and talked. Afterward, she paid rent and moved in that same week. My roommate was very outgoing and partied a lot, and she had a lot of fun. I work from home, so more often than not, I was in the house. I only leave the house whenever I want a different environment to work in, and usually I go to a local coffee shop in the area. My roommate was hardly ever home. She always had to go to work, had a date, a party, or an audition to go for. We barely had time to talk and get to know each other personally, but so far we were good roommates to each other. All was going well until she started to date a very weird-looking dude with a strange, intimidating character. Her boyfriend hardly ever said anything to me. My roommate was barely around, but he mostly was and would simply perch around wherever I was in the house without ever speaking to me. I tried several times to get all chummy with him and start a conversation, but he would just mumble an incoherent response, and sometimes he would just ignore me when I speak to him. He barely even replied to my greeting. My roommate said he was an actor like her, but I'd never seen him go for an audition like my roommate. He was always in the house watching TV, eating food from the fridge, and taking endless naps, most times on the living room couch. My roommate and her boyfriend started to organize parties every Friday in the living room. I was worried and asked her why her parties were so frequent. "We're in the show business," my roommate said. "We need to organize parties and find ways to socialize and expand our network." I was confused. She rolled her eyes. "Well, I don't expect you to get it." I ignored her subtle jab at the quiet life I led and let it go. Every Saturday morning, the kitchen and living room would be very dirty, and I would clean with my roommate, never mind the fact that I was never really invited to the parties. Her boyfriend never cleaned with us too. One Friday night, I was out on a date, and I returned home quite late. As usual, my roommate and her boyfriend were hosting one of their parties, but this time there was a large table, some game going on, and a large stack of cash. I knew immediately that they were gambling. Of course, it didn't go well with me that my roommate's boyfriend had turned my home into a gambling house. I decided to speak to her about it, but I couldn't find her, so I walked up to her boyfriend, tapped him on the shoulder, and asked to speak with him privately. He looked at where I touched them as though an irritating fly had perched on his arm and frowned. "What is it?" he yelled over the loud music. "I need to talk to you," I yelled back. He walked out with me to the kitchen, and it was noisy in there too. I signaled for him to come with me. We went out through the kitchen door, and I tried to control my anger. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "You got a problem?" He looked very uninterested in what I was saying. "What do you mean I got a problem?" "Of course I've got a problem. Is this even legal?" He yawned. "Listen, nerd, we're all just having a little bit of adult fun. Stop making a big deal out of all these." He left me standing outside. I was too upset to go back in, so I called my friend to ask if I could spend the night at hers, and she agreed. The next morning, I was back in my home, and it stank. It was too messy. My roommate wasn't home to clean up the party's mess, and her boyfriend was probably waiting for her to return home and clean. I was beyond disgusted. I packed a few things in my computer and went back to my friends. My friend thought it was unfair for me to have to leave my own house because of the mess he had created. They said next time, just call the police on them. I'd consider that, but I didn't want to be a party pooper. I went to parties in high school, and my friends and I hated when someone tried to ruin our fun. "I'm going to have to speak to her about this when she returns," I said. "Girl, if you don't, I will." My friend was annoyed. I went back home 2 days later. My roommate was in the kitchen filling the fridge with groceries she had just bought. "Hey," she smiled weakly at me. I told her we needed to talk, and then went on to tell her about what happened on Friday. I told her I was not comfortable with having gamblers in my house, and I guess that angered her. "It's my house too," she exclaimed. "I know, but this sort of activity attracts the wrong people. We can never be too careful." I also told her that I could no longer handle seeing my house filled with dirt every Saturday. I was tired of cleaning after grown-ups. She stopped replying and just kept opening cartons and filling up the fridge. I waited for her to say something, to promise to make her boyfriend stop, but she didn't. My roommate and her boyfriend stopped speaking to me altogether, and quite frankly, I didn't care. As long as they no longer used my house as a casino and turned it into an irritating mess the next day. That Friday, the annoying couple didn't have a party, and I was glad. Imagine my joy not waking up to a disgusting kitchen. I was glad. They still weren't speaking to me, and I still didn't care. I honestly thought it was all over until the next Friday. There was no loud music, just strange guys playing poker in the living room. I was enraged. I was more tolerant of the party because I thought it wasn't so harmful, but I could never tolerate weekly gambling in my house. Not after what happened in college. I walked in the living room and threatened to call the police. My roommate and her boyfriend were livid when their company left. "She's just mad because she has a boring life," she said to her boyfriend, but loud enough for me to hear in the kitchen. I ignored her because there was no point arguing. I'd gotten what I wanted anyway. "Boring, boring life," she yelled from the living room. I ignored her still. I knew if I engaged her, we would have a really big fight. I could be very mean too, but I try not to show the mean side of me till I've been pushed to the wall. I was starting to miss my parents, so I bought tickets to fly to Texas. I'd been planning a trip back home for a while, but work always got in the way. I was due to travel the next day, but I didn't want to leave things the way they were with my roommate. I knocked on her room's door to speak with her. I told her about what happened in college and how that made me very wary of having strangers in my home. Her demeanor softened, and she apologized and promised that they were never going to do what happened ever again. On my way out of the house, I saw her boyfriend smiling sheepishly. He looked happy to see me go. I sincerely hoped that she and her boyfriend would not do anything silly and trusted that she would keep her promise and stop the in-house gambling. I spent 5 days in my parents' home, and we talked about everything and everyone, including my roommate and her boyfriend. My mom insisted on letting her go and getting a new roommate. I resisted though. My roommate and I are cool now. I told her what happened in college anyway, and she now understood why I was super concerned about our safety. I was certain that she and I would have no problems ever again, but I was wrong. I returned to LA on Sunday, and the kitchen and living room were a mess. It was all in an irritating state. I stared at the filth before me for so long before moving to my bedroom. I was horrified to see my bedroom door slightly open. I was certain that I didn't leave it open. I would lock my bedroom door when I'm out of the house. I always did that. I walked into my room, and it was then I realized what had happened. I had been burgled. Someone had broken the lock and ransacked my room. My closet was wide open, and all my stuff was on the floor. Clothes, hangers, makeup, and all others. My designer bags and eyeglasses were gone. I had a small wad of cash and a tiny purse, and it was gone too. I broke down in tears. The evil couple I lived with did not hear me because they were probably asleep after bringing Las Vegas to my apartment. My friend was out of town. I could have called her to come over because I needed someone to hold me down so I don't physically attack my roommate. I heard someone in the kitchen and went in to see my roommate cleaning the kitchen, collecting plastic bags and bottles from the floor. She smiled sheepishly when she saw me. "Sorry, my boyfriend could not resist having a party while you were away." Her mouth flew open when I told her that my room was broken into. "Please don't call the police," was the first thing she said. She never apologized, and she did not look sorry. My mom thought I was crazy because I decided not to call the police. I, however, told my roommate that her boyfriend had to leave my house if she wanted me to leave the police out of it. "Why do you have to be such a witch?" she yelled. I ignored her and left for my room to put things in order. Not once did my roommate apologize for my stolen stuff, offer to help clean my room, or even ask about what was missing. She only promised to send her boyfriend away. I was not satisfied with that at all. I knew I was going to get my revenge, and I patiently waited for the right time to carry out my revenge. Her boyfriend did leave, and our relationship improved. 3 weeks later, I heard her screaming excitedly on the phone. From the conversation, she had been invited to the final stage of an audition for a lead role in a movie the next day. She was visibly over the moon with excitement, and even mentioned that she knew one of the judges and she could feel that this was going to be her big break. I knew then that it was my chance to get back at her. I was working in the kitchen when she came bearing fruits and smiling. I initiated a friendly chat about how I was considering getting a dog while she blended her fruits for a smoothie. When she was done with the blending, she kept the smoothie in the fridge. I went to my room and picked a laxative medicine I'd used for constipation a month ago and emptied it into her smoothie. She came to the kitchen a few times to pick some stuff up, but never drank her smoothie. I was worried that my plan would fall through. Well, luck smiled on me. I'd gone to bed later that night, but my roommate woke up at midnight and drank her smoothie. Of course, she got diarrhea and spent quality time in the toilet all through the day. I sat in the living room with a big smile on my face, feeling very compensated for my missing items. Oblivious of what I'd done, she came to the living room to talk to me about her condition. I smiled and said, Please don't call the police. Yes, she missed her big audition. I'm just thinking about myself in OP's shoes, and I would be miserable living in that scenario. Even if these people were coming over and weren't gambling, I'm so comfortable being by myself that I would hate every single week having this group of people come around. Especially considering you have to rely that your roommate and their boyfriend watch all the items of the house, so nobody steals or goes rifling through anything. When there's 2 roommates in a house, do you think it's unreasonable for one of the roommates to bring over groups of people that the other doesn't know at least once a week? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Our next story is my revenge against my horrible racist boss. A thread on horrible bosses? Count me in. I have the experience to share, and it hasn't even been that long since it happened. For context, I'm a 21-year-old African American male, and I stand at 6 feet 3 inches. I've always been one of the tallest people in my class, and I also have very dark skin, so it's pretty normal for me to be the center of attention. Ever since I was a child, I've always been a pretty calm person, so it's quite common to meet people who think that it's an easy way to walk all over me. It's always fun to witness, and even funnier when I prove them wrong. I started modeling 3 years ago when I just turned 18, and because I've got a very peculiar look, I hit it off almost right away. They weren't big jobs that paid a lot because, unlike a lot of models, I didn't start with an agency, and I had to work freelance for a little over a year, taking on small gigs and a lot of free work to build my portfolio to a standard that I thought was good enough. At 19, I finally decided to work with my first agency. I won't say their name here, but they were a smaller agency in my hometown, and I'll admit that they were very helpful in building my modeling career. The only issue that I ever really had was the fact that I really wanted to do editorial modeling, but I was stuck with commercial and fitness modeling, which was ironic because I didn't even work out. I worked with the agency for another year and a half, and I made a ton of friendships and connections that I'll cherish for the rest of my life. One of them in particular was a gorgeous redhead, we'll call her R. Both of us were the youngest models in the agency, so naturally we gravitated toward each other. I enjoyed how quiet she was, much like me, but she could also transform into a whole new person when the both of us were alone. I also admired how she also knew when to speak up for herself and others. She was pretty brave, despite being really petite and standing at 5'5" as one of the smallest models in the agency. In modeling, sometimes there can be bullying and intimidation from older models or people who have generally been in the business for long, and I encountered these kinds of people all the time. I chose to ignore it, but R did quite the opposite. Soon, it made a lot of people respect us even more and stay out of our way. When they walked together, it looked like I, the much larger person, was being guided by a red-haired, walking ball of unbridled rage. Another thing I liked about R was the fact that she was very motivating. After graduating high school, I paused all of my intentions of going to college because of financial difficulties. Em and I worked another job as a virtual assistant to help with my bills. She worked at her parents' restaurant as a waitress and receptionist, and occasionally she cooked too. She also went to community college part-time, which motivated me a lot. Still, she was the one who knew about new opportunities the moment they came out. She always alerted me and dragged me along for as many as we could afford to go for. Casting calls, photography, and modeling events, the whole shebang. It also proved to be very strengthening for our relationship because we seemed to get much closer. Eventually, the hard work paid off because we were both scouted by a huge modeling agency in New York. It worked with some of the most popular models in the fashion scene, and we were so excited. It was also a bonus that we were the first ever models from our small town agency to be accepted into one as big as the one in New York. R had a field day watching the expressions of people who didn't like us change when it was announced a day before we had to leave. Our trip to New York was sponsored by the new agency, as well as the hotel we would be staying at while looking for a more permanent residency. It was a no-brainer that we would end up as roommates because she was now basically my best friend. And New York was a really expensive place. Too expensive for either of us to live alone. We got a place after 3 weeks of living in a hotel and going to photo shoots and fittings every single day. And we finally moved into a nice place in Manhattan. Although it does depend on what you consider nice. For us, Nice meant that there was just one rat instead of an entire family of a million other rodents, like we usually heard about. We even named the rat Johnny, but I digress. We'd been in New York for about a month before we were finally able to meet the agents that were assigned specially to us. R got a lovely African-American woman with the loveliest smile, while I got a snooty blonde man that smoked like a train. We'll call him D because he was a massive D-bag. As I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty easygoing and can work with anyone, so unless there's a real problem that requires me to step back and assess the situation, I don't really care for it. I didn't have any issues with my agent in the beginning, mainly because the agency had already sent me a couple of guidelines and basic information that I needed to know. And I knew that agents usually had more than one model to attend to, so I read everything thoroughly to make sure that I didn't make my agent stress himself too hard on me. The red flag started to pop up when I went in for a fitting for a show that I was supposed to walk in 2 days, and I found out that I was getting paid less than the other models. 2 of them were having a conversation about how they would spend their paychecks, and I overheard the amount. It was 4 times my own. I knew this because the agents usually let us know the payment for each job, in case we want to decline it. Usually I don't talk to other models first unless they initiate a conversation or approach me, because I'm just really quiet and shy. But I had to speak to them so that I could confirm if their agency got paid more. It turned out that one of them actually belonged to the same agency as me, so I worked out that there had to be a mistake on my end. Right after the fitting, I spoke to my agent and let him know what I'd found out. He basically laughed at me over the phone and basically told me that I was being paid less because of how dark my skin was. I was very hurt by his words, but he acted like he was the nice guy, assuring me that we would figure out something else together. I was down for the rest of the day and R noticed, but I covered it up with exhaustion. Over the next couple of months, it felt like my growth was being stilted with my agent. I got lower paying jobs than R or any of the other new model friends I'd made, and they were usually very forgettable ones. Nothing as exciting as a runway or editorial or even catalog modeling. I sometimes did old, boring company advertisements, and at a point, I even went back to fitness modeling. The worst kind of modeling for me. Being a model is stressful enough as it is, but doing a style that you're not comfortable with, nor enjoying, is even more draining. I started to feel less than my other friends and even started to decline to go out with them. I stayed cooped up in my room, researching what jobs I could apply for with only a high school degree because modeling didn't seem to be working for me anymore. R noticed this and she tried to get me out of my slump for a bit. She was at the peak of her career and actually thriving, and I didn't want to bring her down, so I pretended to be down with the flu. Eventually, she caught me in my own lie and demanded that we spend a night in. We did some skincare, her idea, ate loads of Chinese food, drank wine, and just talked. I let her know everything that had been going on, and she told me that she'd had suspicions about my agent D. I personally didn't think it was his fault. It just felt like I was unlucky and this wasn't the job field for me anymore. R assured me the best she could and gave me some motivational words. By the end of the night, I felt much better about myself and my situation. For the next month, there was no improvement work-wise, but at least I had enough work to pay my basic bills. That was until R got her own agent to pull some strings and get us in a shoot together. Since moving, we'd not worked together on any set, so it was nice to get to work with my best friend one more time. It was a great time, and we got lunch afterward because it was for a pretty big fashion house and I wanted to celebrate. R just wanted bottomless mimosas. During lunch, I went to the bathroom and coincidentally ran into one of the models from the same set crying. There was some familiarity, so I inquired about the problem. And he told me that his agent just told him that the company hated his work and that he wouldn't get paid. I felt bad for him, especially since I could personally relate to what he was feeling. I assured him that these things did happen sometimes and that they would only get better. Towards the end of our conversation, I asked him about his agency and wanted to know who his agent was. And he told me that it was the same one I had. His agent was D. Suddenly, nothing felt right about the situation. I parted with him and went back to the table, immediately asking R what she thought of the situation. She informed me that it was way too soon to know that kind of information, and if the company didn't like the shoot, they would just call for a reshoot. This was the moment when we both realized that there was something wrong. R was very good at snooping, and she also had a very nice agent who helped her find out most of the people that were under D. She sent out emails to each of them and somehow got them to rant about D. They all said the same things. He didn't pay them properly, was either racist, sexist, or just downright inappropriate around them. To some, he was all three. He overworked a few of them and sent them off without being paid at all, but they had no idea who to talk to because he was literally their boss. As we read through the emails, I had the idea to compile them into a single file and send them to the very heads of the company. But R had the idea to screw him up a little before we would go that far. We informed the 5 other agents, and they were very much on board with the plan. We did the basic high school things like egging his house and breaking his windows. We scratched his cars badly and lessened his tires. R even went as far as putting water in his engine, and then a salt and sugar concoction. It made things funnier when we found out that he couldn't actually go and report to the police because he had a few assault cases on his tab, and he was basically hiding from the police. After 2 weeks of continuously tormenting him, we decided to give him a small break, as he would soon lose his job. R's birthday came up and we threw a dinner party at our apartment. She invited people from our agency to show up, and unfortunately, D showed up. Everyone was visibly uncomfortable when he came, but he didn't let it derail him from being weird. He drank a lot and tried numerous times to get into our rooms, nearly hitting R when she tried to stand up to him. We kicked him out of our apartment, and that night, we decided to send the email to the board in charge of the agency as a whole. It was so stressful waiting for a response from the team, which came about a month later. But when it did, there were a lot of apologies and promises to look into the case. They worked fast because within 2 days, D's name had been cleared from the entire agency's system. It was almost like he never even existed there. We, the victims, were reimbursed all of the money that we were owed, and then some. We were also allocated to new agents who treated us much better than D ever did. The case was pretty serious, and the entire agency had to update everyone on policies, urging us to speak out if we ever witnessed or were victims in similar cases. It felt empowering to know that R and I were mainly responsible for making the agency a safer place. If you're ever wondering how D ended up, I'll update you. He got charged with multiple cases of assault and sexual misconduct, as well as other smaller cases he racked up over the years. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison without the option of bail. Does anybody else think that, considering how awful and off D was from the start, that it's almost just flat out disappointing that it took all that action and all that buildup before somebody tried to report them to somebody above D's head? I'm just wondering why it had to be this major bombshell before anybody ever reported it. And our final story of the day is gang revenge. I joined a gang in my teens. I didn't need to. I came from a middle-class family. I had both my parents and they were really present in my life. I joined because I was stupid and rebellious. My parents didn't know what to do with me, even though they tried their best to reach me. I eventually ended up in prison, and even that wasn't enough to wake me up. It took my mom getting sick while I was inside to finally let me see the light. I'd been in for a while and had to do some unpleasant things to stay alive, but eventually I was able to jump out and work in enough good behavior to get paroled, but it was too late. My mom died before I could show her that I'd changed. Before I could tell her how sorry I was for everything I put her through. The whole time I was inside, my neighbors took care of her. They were an elderly couple who used to babysit me when my parents worked late. I heard the old lady visited my mom every day. The old man would always tell my dad not to give up on me and that I would eventually come around. He even visited me a few times when I was inside. I moved back home with my dad after my release and went to thank the old couple for everything they had done for us. The old lady wasn't doing too well herself, and it seemed like any day now it was going to be her turn. There weren't a lot of people at her funeral, just some of her friends, my dad, and me. The old man had had her entire casket covered with flowers from their garden. The two of them had the most beautiful flower garden on the street. As long as I knew them, they were working on that garden together. After she was gone, he went back to working in the garden on his own. I was struggling to find work because of my record, and my dad had to work away from home a lot for the travel pay. I didn't have any friends anymore, and I really didn't want to go outside, so I spent a lot of time just watching the street from the lounge window. I started to get to know the neighborhood pretty well. I started paying particular attention to one kid down the street. Not for any weird reason, I just saw a lot of my old self in him. He was a menace, especially to my neighbor. For some reason, this degenerate lowlife, I know it's rich coming from me, was tearing up the old man's garden at night. What's worse was the next day, the old man would quietly go about his day fixing the damage without saying anything to anyone. I wanted to tear this kid's legs off, but I knew that everyone knew about my record and it'll be bye-bye parole, so I waited. 1 week in a month, his parents would leave him alone at home to go to wine country, and that was when he would go and destroy the garden. I needed a weekend when both my dad and his parents were away so that I could teach him some manners. I had to make sure that I prepared myself well. I collected supplies, made recordings of what I needed to say, and watched the street. Then the weekend came. His parents left, and so did my dad. I went to my basement and got everything ready and waited for nightfall. Like clockwork, he came around 11 p.m. His rampage didn't take long, so I only had a few minutes. As soon as he was done and making his way back home, I jumped him in the dark shadows between the houses. I drugged him and carried him to my basement. When he woke up, he was properly blindfolded, gagged, and tied to a bed without his shirt on. I didn't have any soundproofing, so I made sure that his gag was not coming off. I had no intention of feeding him or giving him water. I wasn't going to keep him long, but I still wanted him to suffer. I pressed play on the recording that had a voice scrambler explaining everything that I was doing to him. I got out my tools and began using the skills I picked up inside. I wasn't concerned about being gentle. I made it hurt, but he was warned that the more he moved, the more I'd hurt him. The first few times he squirmed and even screamed, so I kept my word. He stopped moving after that. I was on a clock, so I couldn't take my time as I used to in prison, but I finished just in time to send him home before either of our parents got back. The old man's garden was never touched again. That kid spent a significant part of his life wearing long sleeves and not taking off his shirt in public. I had given him a prison resume on his skin, claiming that he belonged to gangs he was never a part of and had done things only the hardest of criminals do. If anyone in those gangs saw him with that ink, it was an instant death sentence. You know, as much as OP claims that they're reformed and they're so much better now, kidnapping somebody and putting almost permanent ink on their back that if exposed to the wrong person may try to kill him, who really is the bad person here? The one stomping some flowers or the one permanently marking a kid? Third grade bully. In the third grade, I was an awkward kid. Had a mean, drunk father, struggled to fit in and make friends, was bullied and shunned by the other kids. One of my classmates, let's call him Derek, who regularly partook in bullying me, showed me kindness one day. Being deprived of kindness or attention so regularly, I was putty in his hands. He hanged out with me during recess when I was usually alone. We laughed and talked about girls we like. He even apologized for being a jerk to me. The reason he was nice to me was because I'd brought a very popular, expensive Batman action figure to school with me to pass the time, since I was alone mostly. I saved allowance and mowed lawns for 2 months to buy that toy. Everyone wanted one. By the end of the day, he asked me if he could lend the action figure, and like the naive, socially inept kid I was, I trusted him with it. The deal was to return it the following morning. I went home so happy, completely fooled, I never suspected a thing. The following day, he completely ignored me. When I tried to talk to him, he acted like I was crazy. When I asked him to return the action figure, he simply said, "You never gave me any, Batman. Maybe you imagined it." And when I persisted, he threatened to beat my butt. When I complained to my teacher, I was told that it was my own fault for bringing toys to school. I was afraid they would involve my father, so I dropped it. I couldn't let my father know or I would be called a softie and have my butt beat and punished for the next 2 weeks. What's worse is Derek told all the girls that I confided to him about fancying that I lusted after them and that I pleased myself to them. I was a social outcast before that, but at least I was tolerated. But after his smear campaign with the girls, I was a leper. People wouldn't even look me in the eyes, not even the teachers. Kids started throwing stones at me, sabotaged and vandalized my property. It was heck. I did nothing about it but cry. I was just a weak-willed kid after all, but to this day, I wish I'd bit someone's ear off or something. Anything in retaliation. After a while, the bullying died down. I focused on my studies and started getting good grades. Derek started talking to me again, but I ignored him completely. Sometimes he would repeat, "Why are you being such a baby? You didn't give me anything. You imagined it." By the end of the year, we moved houses and I transferred to another school not far away. Things were much better there. I finally had friends and I wasn't as naive anymore, so I wasn't as easily targeted. But I was still mostly me and still got picked on now and then. Over the years, I became somewhat of a delinquent. And in high school, I got into regular fights. I may have been overcompensating for the lack of a spine I had in my younger years. I bartended in nightclubs, hotels, and cruise liners in my early 20s. This helped me a lot to be more socially adept and to understand social dynamics and human nature. I finished trade school and qualified as an electrician and later as a plumber. I know, water and electricity, but believe it or not, I thought it was ingenious at the time. I started my own business, developed a reputation for excellent workmanship in my local area, and did well for myself. When I was 29, I'm 36 now, I received a call out at 2 in the morning for a flooding emergency at a local residence. When I got there, the place was a mess. Water was jetting out of a burst pipe, and electrical equipment was shorted. It was highly dangerous. The living room floor was caved in due to a sinkhole. I was met by the wife, let's call her Jane, hysterical and beside herself. She somehow thought that she was responsible, which I found odd. I assured her that it couldn't possibly be her fault. He arrived not 5 minutes later. His demeanor was irate. He didn't greet or shake my hand when I offered. I recognized him immediately, Derek from all those years ago. He demanded to know why I haven't begun fixing the issue yet. I was professional. I told him what I told the wife in terms of costs, but I hid the written quote in my vehicle. I told him who I was and acted happy to see him, assured him that he was in good hands. After a while of arguing with his wife, he seemed to calm down and joke around with me. I knew I had fooled him. We talked about our careers, kids, our school days. I gave him tips and fake recommendations. We got along great. His trust was easy to gain. He must have thought of me as a complete sucker. I assured him that he was in good hands and this would be fixed in no time. I was careful not to start any actual work on the property. Doing the smallest thing would make me responsible for all of it. Derek left after an hour or so, and his wife stayed behind. I started my revenge. When I was doing my assessment, I noticed that most of the building did not comply with city regulation and did not adhere to the registered and approved plans. There were multiple safety hazards, and all the plumbing and electrical work were completed by unqualified and uncertified people in an attempt to save money. Also, the pipe in question had been leaking for a few weeks at least, getting worse by the day, and finally causing disaster, which means their water bill would be astronomical at the end of the month, unless a qualified plumber endorses a rebate with the municipality. I called my contact at the city, let's call him Donovan, and notified him of all the regulatory violations, safety hazards, and non-city compliant installations on the property. I also told him of the possible water bill. He promised to be there the next day. I immediately started photographing and documenting. The following morning, my contact was there at 10. He had a field day. He informed Derek's wife of the calamity that was to come. They would be forced to tear down all of the building additions, remove all the uncertified plumbing and wiring installations, have the plans reapproved and start from scratch, which is an estimated loss of approximately $950,000. Derek was there in minutes. He was livid. He quickly threatened legal action, but Donovan simply told him that he had more than enough photograph evidence to have the property declared invalid within a week if Derek did not comply in writing. Donovan reminded Derek that he does this for a living and that the city has more legal resources to waste money on. I left Derek an invoice for my time just to smear salt in the wound and took my leave. Later, he called me and called me every name under the sun. I remained silent and he hung up. He went on a Facebook rant about me, which was a bad idea. All of the community stood up for me, and it started a storytelling competition where all kinds of people revealed stories of unsavory things Derek did to them in the past. Apparently, Derek has always been a jerk. He never changed. One day he called me and asked to meet. He sounded defeated and depressed, so I decided to meet and see what's up. I met him at a local busy convenience store. I know better than to take Derek the Weasel at face value, so I noticed quickly when he laid his phone screen down on the table. I knew he may be recording the conversation. He apologized for his behavior, which surprised me, and told me that this whole dilemma has all but bankrupted him. He told me he took out a loan for the building additions and cut corners to save money, that everyone does it. He showed me the water bill, which was nearly $80,000, a problem easily erased with a qualified plumber's signature and endorsement. I refused. He got irate again. Then he asked me, "Why did you do this to me? I know I was a jerk to you when we were kids, but I don't deserve to have my and my wife's lives ruined because of mistakes I made when I was a kid. What kind of person are you? You told me I was in good hands. I trusted you. You assured me you would help me, and then you stabbed me in the back. You quoted me only a few hundred and told me not to worry." I replied, "I said no such thing." He says, "Stop lying. You told me that it would cost a few hundred, maybe less. I heard you say it. You promised to help me, gave me recommendations. Why are you doing this to me?" I said, "Derek, you must have imagined it." I said, "Derek, you must have imagined it." I looked him in the eye. He knew exactly why I said that. The same thing he told me almost 20 years ago. I repeated it just to drive it home. "You're being a baby. I never quoted you for anything. You imagined it." He knew I was destroying him financially because of a Batman action figure he stole from me 20 years ago. I could see it in his eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. His expression was a mixture of astonishment and disgust. I looked him dead in the eyes for a few seconds for effect, then got up and left. I slept like a baby that night and had a goofy smile all week after. He tried calling a few times, but I sent him a text stating that further harassment will be met with legal action. Derek, you know what your real name is and what mine is. If in the future you read this and realize how I screwed you over, remember how costly that little Batman action figure was to you after years of accumulated interest in karma. The look of despair on your face when you realize why you are ruined was delicious. I cackled maniacally on that drive home from that convenience store. It was time for you to pay the piper. And if you think this will help you legally, go ahead and try. It won't, so don't waste your time. Or rather do, waste as much time and money. I welcome being even more of a financial inconvenience to your life. Freak you, Derek. Do you guys think OP went a little far with the revenge here? Or do you think the 20 years of bullying PTSD that OP had to deal with made it more than worth it? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. And by the way, if you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons as well. Our next story is Old Fart Gets His Revenge. Revenge-tastic. This story was from my grandpa, who knew this guy when he was growing up in the 1960s. So we'll call this guy Henry. He was old as crap when the story took place. In New Mexico in the early 1960s, Henry owned a decent-sized ranch. Now Henry was a cool dude. In his younger days, he fought in World War I and was rumored to be a gunfighter in the last days of the Wild West. He was also rumored to be associated with the mafia in Chicago in the 1920s when he went to college. Henry had about 15 ranch hands and 3 sons. He had lots of cattle and land. His youngest son was in the army at this point in time, and the other 2 had other jobs. A lot of his ranch hands were black, and some were refugees fleeing racial violence in the East at that time. So one evening, his guys were attacked and beaten up, and a couple of his cows were killed by unknown attackers. But it was pretty obvious it was the guys in the white pointy hats. After assessing the situation, he couldn't really do much, and the police were useless as the town police force was pretty much useless as it had like 2 guys. These attacks continued for a couple of weeks. No one was beat up, but some cows were killed and fences and stuff were destroyed. Henry received a note saying that he had to get rid of all of his black workers by the end of the week, or they were gonna burn down his ranch and kill everyone and everything. So he kinda said screw this and called his son, who just happened to be on leave. His son and a couple of his army buddies were on leave, and they pretty much had nothing else to do but come over. He was also really good friends with a biker gang in the area, who he probably helped hide bodies on his land with, so they come over and helped him prepare. No, he didn't want the police involved as he was an old freak and did things the old-fashioned way. So he sent a couple of ranch hands over to the town to get drunk and distract the police, and he would bail them out in the morning. Basically, it was two underpaid cops trying to contain the drunken madness in a bar in a small town in the middle of the New Mexico desert. So one night, the white pointy hat guys pulled up ready to trash the place. The remaining ranch hands were having a bonfire and seemed completely oblivious to their impending doom. They were strapped though. Henry had his son and his buddies and the bikers hidden in the barns and sheds ready to attack. When the pointy hat guys showed up, they had gasoline cans and some weapons. There were about 10 of them. Basically, it plays out that the cowboys all acted drunk until the bikers and soldiers showed up and surrounded the pointy hat guys, and then they pulled their guns out. Now, I never heard if anyone was killed or if he just gave them a good scare, but there hasn't been a single racial incident or animal murdered in that town since then. Also, Henry died a couple of years later from cancer, probably because he smoked and dipped for like 60 years, because it was healthy back then. Anyway, Grandpa was cool, and he knew a lot of cool guys like Henry. This next story is Betray Me? Welcome to Heck. I, 40s, dated a man, 35, for less than a year. I met him here on Reddit. It was serious, intense, and fast. I love yous, proposed marriage, the whole shebang. I was all the way in. He ended it out of the blue one day a couple of months back. What he said prompted my sixth sense to go positively crazy. I did a tiny bit of research and poof, there is his very married self and his lovely wife, 30, on Facebook of all places. Yes, I'm stupid. He told me he was divorced. You're supposed to trust the people you love, right? I confronted him, told his wife, then went into shock. Turns out I'm one of at least 100 women he slept with or been in a full-blown relationship with in the full decade he's been with his wife, married only 3 years. Many of them have contacted her over the years. She shrugs and stays. She tracks his GPS, sees he's cheating or had the feeling that something is wrong, and does nothing. He shows no remorse. One thing he texted me when I confronted him was, I was just supposed to freak you, then leave. I didn't. He was in my city for almost 4 months for a job, several states away from home. He told his wife I was only his girlfriend in her mind. That crushed me. The cold cancellation, I'll never get past it. Apart from the betrayal, there was also the grooming, and I don't mean sexually. He was effortlessly abusive. He manipulated me from day one. I'm a lot like his wife. Same body type, deeply loving, attachment issues, forgiving, empathetic caretakers. Women like us are often safe harbors for broken men. Never the freak again. Never betray a woman with a healthy sense of justice who also wanted to be a private investigator as a kid. The revenge. Publicize, demonize, fire. I started a Facebook page, screenshots of so many indiscretions, a full narrative on just how messed up he is. I sent links to 10 family members, spoke with 3, the jig is up. They had no idea about the cheating, the lying, the atrocious behavior. So far, my favorite part? I got him so fired. Emails to HR, legal, his boss's boss, and of course I CC'd him. Screenshots of him bad-mouthing them, wanting to sleep with subordinates, drug use, hidden DUI, his temper, all of it. Anything that he 1, did or said, and 2, would get him fired. The things I sent to his job? 1, the text of a long post on Facebook detailing how freaked up he is with all the specifics. Mental illness, cheating, etc. I sent the link to this post and my profile to many, 10 total, close family members. Most didn't open or read the messages. I deleted/indent the ones who hadn't seen it. His wife's longtime best friend talked to me. She had no idea about most of his actions. I emailed the text of the post to HR, legal, his boss, etc. 2. Links to posted text screenshots of his bullcrap on the Facebook page. 3. I emailed screenshots of text messages detailing the following to HR, legal, etc. 1. His DUI. His second that he had in January that he hid from the company. 2. Screenshots proving he slept with a contractor and housed her in his hotel during the job. That might be fraud if they were expensing both his room and her room. I didn't mention that in any email. 3. Screenshots of his lost weekend doing coke and ecstasy. I do none of that and was horrified I couldn't contact him those days. He disappeared for 2 days, when he would have been working on the job site. 4. Screenshots of describing how much he hated his boss, executives, coworkers, because they were all idiots. 5. Screenshots of his violent temper where he apologized for yelling at me and others. 6. Screenshots of texts talking about how he should quit and take the 2 friends he had there with him. 7. Screenshots of texts where he talks crap about the CEO. 8. Screenshots of his dating profiles and company branded clothing. And 9. Text screenshots of him detailing how hard it is not to lash out and be mean to people. Depression, mental illness. He's a traveling project manager for an engineering firm, and he's a mess. But it was a slow trickle seeing all of this behavior. He's been doing this work since 2005, moving his way up the ladder to the low 6-figure salary he used to earn. Sometimes he's in a city for 4 months, sometimes a few weeks, almost always west of the Mississippi. He lives in the South. Today, I read an email sent to me last week confirming he's fired. I jumped for joy. The goal? Go home, stop lying to women. Why does this matter? Why does he need to stop traveling all the time and go home? Because his job is everything to him. He travels 90% of the year. He hides in it. He uses it as a weapon against his wife, so many women, and against any accountability. He said this verbatim in texts. He loves the work he does more than almost anything in the world. It's his only escape and relief, and the only thing he's good at. Losing the job is the nuclear option, short of hospitalization. He's home now, trapped, no more freedom to use and abuse women at will with no consequences. He's furious. Good. He knows it was me. Good. But he'll just find another job, you say? Oh, I'm counting on it. That's phase 2. I'll email them too. And the company after that. And the company after that. It's a pretty simple email. Just gotta press send. If he changes and becomes a decent human being, great. Too late. Enjoy this destruction you brought upon yourself. This is for all the previous girlfriends you messed over. Mwah. The Facebook page is still up and will remain visible for now. No, I'm not going to post the link. Too much identifying information. I don't want to destroy his family. I want him to stop hurting women. I'm hoping this will 1. Really upset him, and 2. Spook him into getting help. One of the last things he said after I confronted him was, "I know how this ends," meaning his wife will never leave him and he'll face no consequences. Think again, kid. Our next story is a man harassed me and I got his retirement benefits taken away. So this took place over 3 years, give or take some. I, 29-year-old female, left the military and picked up a contracting job in the same field. While I was starting my new career, I was also leaving an unhappy and abusive marriage. My ex-husband, 29-year-old male, was a store manager at a GameStop, and when asked if he gave military discounts, he would give military discounts and ask if people knew me on base and what I was up to. A man we'll call Bubble Bass, 35-ish-year-old male, actually worked for me, and the two of them bonded over their mutual hate for women. Bubble Bass would refer to me as a tramp and tramp at work, and even went so far as to attempt to get my home address to give to my ex. I reported the incidents through proper channels and had to get a new apartment, but unsurprisingly, the military did nothing to Bubble Bass. So I decided to keep my eyes on him and wait until he made another misstep. Over the next 3 years, working with him was horrible. He would undermine my authority in the section by telling junior people I was stupid, being intentionally insubordinate, and publicly talking about how he was exploiting the foster care system to make money off the children he was supposed to be taking care of. About a year ago now, another girl, 20-year-old female, came to me and told me that Bubble Bass was approaching her in a way that made her uncomfortable. When I pulled up their chat logs, Bubble Bass was begging her to hook up with him even though he was married, and she was repeatedly telling him she wasn't interested. I convinced the girl to report Bubble Bass despite her hesitation. During the investigation, while I was interviewed, I spared no detail about what exactly Bubble Bass was doing and saying, to include fraud, waste, and abuse of government assets and systems. I kept a literal crap list with dates and times. As things turned out, there were about 4 other women at our base Bubble Bass was sexually harassing. Bubble Bass went to non-judicial punishment this week and lost everything. He has 18 years in the military and was 2 years away from a full retirement. He lost his clearance. He lost his foster children. He lost his honorable discharge. He is literally starting life over in his 30s with a discharge that shows he sexually harasses women with no benefits and 18 years of training in a job field that's only relevant if he has a clearance. I have no sympathy for a creep like this who's trying to prey on young girls. This dude's halfway through his 30s and he's trying to pressure some 20-year-old girl who's clearly uncomfortable and wants nothing to do with any of this, but had to be convinced to report it. This dude was just creepy and preying on people, and they flat out deserved losing what they did. Our next story is my grandmother almost killed my mother's first fiancé. My grandmother told me this story and I wanted to share. This all happened in 1985, so this was before security cameras were a household thing. Plus, this happened in Bum Freak, Georgia. My grandmother Clara told me that when my mom, Angela, turned 19, she got engaged to a man. Richard, his actual name by the way. Clara noticed that he was very controlling, i.e. she couldn't use a phone, the landline, and he forbid her from going to family events. Clara's final straw was when my mom called her in the middle of the night crying, saying she couldn't do it anymore and that he'd been hurting her. By this point, they'd been together for almost 2 years and had my older brother. Clara told my mom to go to my great-grandfather's house and stay there, but tell Richard that she was going to her house. My mom did as she was asked and Clara waited for him. He eventually came in the middle of the night, yelling that Angela needed to come home and stop acting like a child. Clara told Richard that she was inside. He went in, and Clara came in behind him and hit him over the head with a bat that she had set beside the inside of the door. Richard fell to the floor, and Clara hit him several times in the legs and arms, breaking one of his arms and fracturing a rib. When she was done, she told him never to come near her daughter or he would be in a ditch next. He never came back. Pretty sure he burned my mom's stuff, but she didn't care. I definitely think this took place kind of in the olden days, or at least, a while back. If this happened in more modern times, as much as the guy might have deserved it, I don't think it would have ended as cleanly for Clara as it did here. And our final story of the day is Dad breaks into our house, we make his life heck. My dad is not a good person by any means of the word, and this is going to involve some serious trauma. The characters are Dad, the worst father of all time, Mom, biological, Ryan, my twin brother, Keon, my older sister, and Dusty, my stepfather. The before, way back when Keon was born, Dad had already fallen off the wagon. The first thing he ever did was physically force Mom into doing drugs to make sure she stayed with him. Following her birth, things only got worse. While Mom would do what she could, Dad was not happy about having a kid. He'd lock Keon in her room for days at a time, because obviously you can't make meth while hearing how hungry your child is. 2 years later, Mom was pregnant with Ryan and me. She immediately tried quitting the drugs and had some success, but having meth in our system, we were at serious risk. Ryan and I were born with huge complications: premature, barely breathing, and weakened immune systems. After that came the worst few months for Mom to endure. While having 1 kid made Dad angry, having 3 made him fly completely off the handle. It was at this time Mom made the hard decision to call the Department of Children and Families on herself. She knew we weren't safe and wanted a way for us to escape this situation. Mom willfully signed away her rights to us, and Dad of course wanted to fight. Both were arrested for child abuse and endangerment, don't cook meth with kids in the house, as well as the drugs. It took 4 years and hundreds of letters for Mom to get into rehab. As this was happening, my siblings and I lived with our grandmother, who we grew up calling Mom. My grandmother had no intention on fully adopting us, but she was left with little choice after a few years. It was either adopt us, or we would be taken into the Department of Children and Families care. Life was better for us mostly. There's a reason I never mentioned my adoptive father, and we were safe. After a few years in rehab, Mom was able to get back in touch with us. She was welcomed, and I ended up crying because I found out my adoptive mom wasn't my real mom. We did get to leave kindergarten early the day she came home though. We grew as a family and it was good. After a few years of this, my adoptive father left the picture. Now everything is actually great. My grandmother passed away in 2017. This was hard for everybody, but especially for Mom. She was devastated, losing the one person who believed she could become clean, a good person, and a great mother. Now, Dad gets out of prison and goes back in every few years, and he usually tries to get in touch when he does. This year was different. We didn't have our grandma to make sure everything would stay safe, and Mom didn't think she could handle seeing him. The mistake? The day comes to bury my grandmother. It was a particularly warm November day. We're all having a hard time and don't deal with grief too well. I stayed with Mom the entire time, while Ryan went to our other grandparents to help out. Keon stayed in her room the whole time. We occasionally checked in on her. Night falls and we're looking through old pictures of Grandma. We were finally able to stop crying. That is, until we hear some heavy banging on our door, followed by it swinging open, and in walks Dad. He goes straight to Keon's room, and Mom is simply frozen. This is the first time I've ever seen her this way. He eventually leaves on his own after some screaming and making Keon cry. He ended up taking her money and then hitting her. Dusty's already called the police already. We have a police scanner. Dusty's been outside the whole time, and as soon as Dad left, he went to confront him. Mom had to snap herself out of that frozen state and called Dusty inside. She didn't know if Dad was armed or anything and didn't want to take any chances. Dad goes across the street and pulls stuff out of his pocket as the cops pull up. He was dumping his bath salts right in front of the cops. He ends up getting arrested and we get a restraining order. That's not the last we see of him though. Over the next few years, we hatch a plan to make sure he regrets ever threatening our family again. The plan we managed to come up with was initially supposed to be petty and mildly inconvenient, but it ended up being so much more. We were just going to call the police every week or so on him. If he had something he wasn't supposed to have, back to jail. This didn't work out as planned and the turnout was much more severe. Dad gets out of prison and lives with his mom. Now, the problem with this is that we regularly go visit our grandparents, which means he'd either have to leave or we couldn't go. I'm going to call my other grandma Nana to keep things more coherent. Nana would always make him leave if we came over, no matter what temperature, time, or weather conditions. This would also apply to whenever we stay the night. We visited Nana so much after knowing what she'd do to see us. This was just our way of saying screw you to our dad. The thing about this meant that he was essentially homeless. He didn't have a car and could barely find a job. When a job did hire him, he'd post in or Nana would tell us. We'd give them a call and have them do a drug test. He always failed the drug tests. So now he's essentially homeless, having the police called on him and on drugs. He gets tired of this pretty quickly and goes back to Nana's when we're there. A clear violation of the restraining order, so he gets fined. This isn't a meager amount of money either. This ruined his savings. So now he's also broke and got kicked out of Nana's. Now he starts to realize he's pretty screwed. We call the police for a suspicious man sleeping on the sidewalk, and he had drugs on him. Back to jail. At least he had a bed. After a few times of this, he's finally broken, devoid of all hope. He manages to get Nana to let him stay there again, so now we get more updates. This has been going on for months now, and we weren't going to stop. Job gone, home gone, money gone, drugs gone, hope gone. He actually started to be clean for a bit. Hard to get drugs if you can't buy them, and when you do, they immediately get confiscated. That is until he finds a new woman. He gets back on the drugs thanks to her money. So what do? Get her arrested while he's gone. We're being extra careful not to get him arrested anymore, since he'd end up in federal prison this time. After so many times getting caught with drugs, our state sends them to federal. Now we've taken away his girlfriend too. The effect, all of this has worn him down. He's gone. Anytime he'd regain even a tiny bit of hope, we'd snuff it out. He eventually tries to end things with a gun that he's not supposed to have, and he fails. So now we have to watch him suffer in the hospital while knowing he gets taken to prison as soon as he heals. We had to make things worse for him. We couldn't let the times we didn't call the police go unnoticed after all. We hide some drugs and ingredients in his dresser, easily noticeable when the police come to search. He now has quite a while in federal prison. I don't think I have any room to comment on this other than saying that this certainly was a nuclear revenge. Is prom night ruined? How I got back at my stepsister for ruining my dress. A few years back, my dad got married to his model girlfriend. She's a very nice woman and I met her children twice. The first time was when my dad threw her a birthday party, and the second was when we all had dinner together and dad proposed. Her first child had just gotten into college at the time, and the second was a year and some months older than me. The 2 times we met, we talked about school and her friends, and I thought she'd be a sweet person, and that I'd finally gotten a sister, but I thought wrong. I didn't get to see the nasty side of her until our parents moved in together. My stepsister was the nastiest, most selfish, and self-centered person I had ever seen. She somehow thought the world revolved around her and expected everyone to do her bidding. It was exhausting, so I mostly avoided her. A few weeks before my quinceañera, I was very excited to dress up and have a party. My mom sent a dress from the UK, but it was a bit bigger and not a good fit. I wasn't happy about this, but since my stepmom is a model and has a good relationship with people in the fashion industry, she found me a very nice dress. It was a lacy royal blue dress and it was lovely. When I wore it for everyone to see, my stepmom and dad gasped. It was a lovely dress. "Don't ever take that dress off," my stepmom exclaimed and hugged me. I had not had a birthday party since my parents got divorced, so my dad was very invested in ensuring that I have a good party for my quince. This probably annoyed my selfish, self-absorbed stepsister. She kept pouting and didn't want to get involved. One day I was in the kitchen reading a novel and eating chips when my stepsister asked if I was busy. I was irritated, of course. I was busy reading, but I knew she didn't care about that. She once barged into my room in the middle of a phone conversation with my mom to rant about her mother bothering her. Even when I pointed out the obvious to her, she just shrugged, said sorry, and continued to talk. Anyway, I asked her what she wanted, and she asked if she could ask for a favor. I just knew she wanted something. I know how she looks when she wants something. She folds her mouth up and tries to make a puppy look. I think she looks terrible when she does that, but it seems to work for her, or else why would she keep doing it? She says, "Can I borrow your dress?" I say, "Sure, what dress?" She says, "The blue dress." I didn't have any blue dress that I know of, and I didn't think she could be asking for the dress I got from my quince. I say, "I don't have a blue dress." She says, "You do, the one mom got you last week?" I wasn't sure I heard right. I started to wonder if she thought I was stupid. I say, "You want to borrow my quince dress?" "Yes," she made the ugly puppy face. "I want to wear it to homecoming. The dress is so fine, plus I want to be voted homecoming queen." I say, "But it's for my quince." She rolled her eyes and sighed, "It's just a queen's party. This is homecoming, and the crown's at stake." I say, "It's pronounced quince. Quinceañera," I said, very irritated. She said, "Okay, whatever, but hey, this is homecoming. Please do this for me." I say, "I can't do that. I may be open to you borrowing it after my party, but not before my quince." She says, "Oh God, why is this quince thing such a big deal? How about I trade you? You give me that dress, and I'll give you an even better looking dress." I say, "No thanks." She says, "Really? The dress is blue anyway. It doesn't compliment your eyes, but it'd look really good on me because I have blue eyes." I was annoyed at that point, and I did not want to start a fight, so I simply ignored her and continued to eat my chips. She says, "Yes?" I say, "No, there's no way I'm going to change my mind about this." She walked away and returned more than 30 minutes later in my dress. I was angry and I wanted nothing more than to move closer to her and slap her across the face. I say, "Why are you wearing my dress? What's wrong with you?" She says, "Calm down, babes. I wanted you to see how good it would look on me. Listen, I'll give you a better dress. I have a really beautiful dress you could wear." "Well, I don't want any of your beautiful dresses," I shot back. "Take off my dress and give them to me, and don't ever touch my stuff without my permission ever again." She says, "Why are you being so loud? Chill, it's okay if you won't lend it to me. Can I at least take a picture to show my friends?" I say, "No, you cannot, and please take off my dress." She rolled her eyes. "Take it off now." I hated raising my voice, but I shouted. She says, "Hey, not in the kitchen. Come on, I'll take it off in your room and put it back." "I don't get why you're so angry, it's just a dress." I decided I was going to tell my dad and stepmom about it, but the two of them were away for a destination wedding, and I would have to report to them when they returned. I had no issues with my stepsister judging me, acting like a diva around the house, and violating some of my boundaries, but walking into my room to take and wear my clothes was extremely rude and disrespectful. My stepmom returned home the day after, but my dad had to fly to another state on a business trip, so I mentioned to my stepmom how disrespected I felt by her daughter's actions and request. She apologized and promised to talk to her and make her apologize, but I suspected she wouldn't do that. She would either not speak to her, or she would, and my stepsister would blatantly refuse to do it without her mother enforcing any consequences. The truth is, my stepsister is a brat, and I blame her mom for it. She never says no to her, she never enforces any punishment or makes her do anything or even behave well. It was almost like she was scared of even correcting her. It turned out my stepmother did speak to my stepsister because she did knock on my door later that evening to apologize. I accepted her apology and happily looked forward to my keens. Not only was it my first birthday party in a while, but I also looked forward to looking good, being the center of attention, dancing with my friends, and meeting my 2-year-old half-brother for the first time. On our school's homecoming day, my stepsister said she wasn't going for homecoming and would be visiting her best friend instead. She left that morning. I didn't care about that, of course. My stepmother was taking me to the mall to get nice shoes later that day anyway, so I barely had time to wonder why my stepsister, who's extremely obsessed with looking good and being the life of every party, would miss homecoming. My birthday was on a Saturday, and my keens was to take place the evening of the next day. On that Sunday, my mom arrived in the morning, my dad took me to the hotel to see her, and I was excited to finally meet my half-brother. I stayed back for a while to chat and catch up with my mom, while my dad went back to our house to supervise the decoration. Later, he came to pick me up so I could start getting dressed. The makeup artist was around when I got home, a very pleasant woman my stepmom hired. I decided to take a quick shower before getting started, and on entering my closet, I noticed my beautiful dress had been tampered with. It just was not sitting right in the large white box it came in. When my stepsister tried it on and replaced it, I'd gone back to my closet and took it out carefully to refold it. It had to be that she came back to try it on again. I took it out of the box and was horrified at the smell that greeted me. I immediately suspected that she'd worn my dress anyway. The dress reeked of alcohol and sweat, and it looked dull and certainly not new. When I raised it, I noticed it had ripped at the hem. Anger did not quite describe what I felt. It had to be my stepsister. No one else could have done that. I decided to check her Instagram page. My stepsister posts everything on Instagram. She definitely would have taken pictures of herself at homecoming. I was correct. She wore my dress to her homecoming. I was so mad that I started to cry. My dad knocked to tell me the makeup artist was waiting. "I pay her hourly and she's expensive," he joked. I was still crying and I guess he heard me. "Sweetheart, what's going on?" I couldn't even bring myself to respond. I had planned to have the most seamless keens, and now my stepsister had ruined it. My dad left and returned later. "Can I come in?" I didn't want him to worry, so I managed to say yes. He carefully walked in like he was afraid to upset me. "What is it, honey? Did your mother say something to upset you?" I say no. He says, "What is it then? Are you nervous?" I showed him the rip on my dress. "Is that the dress?" he asked, looking quite surprised. I started to cry again, and my dad could not reconcile this ripped, smelly, bent out of shape dress with the dress I had worn for everyone to see when my stepmom first brought it home. What happened? My dad was angry now, and I could see that in his eyes. When I told him my stepsister wore my dress to her homecoming and ruined it, he simply walked out. I heard him yelling from downstairs some minutes later, so I dashed out of my room. He and my stepmom were arguing and he was visibly infuriated. She spent a whole year planning for this day, and I would not have anyone ruin this for her, I heard him say. Just in the middle of the argument, my stepsister walked in. What the heck have you done? Her mother screamed at her. She looked confused, but when she looked up and saw me at the top of the stairs holding onto my dress, she probably understood. She looked away and started to cry. I'm sorry, she said, sobbing. My dad hissed and walked out. How could you do this? You have lots of dresses. You could have asked for a new dress if you wanted one. How can you be so selfish? I could have sworn my stepmom was going to hit her. She was moving close to her and almost shaking in anger. She didn't hit her anyway, but she came to me and took the dress to examine the level of damage done to it. My God, she exclaimed. Even if we have it laundered, what about the rip? It's getting late. She pressed her palms to her face. I can fix it, my stepsister muttered. I can sew. I learned to sew in. Shut up and get out, my stepmom interrupted and started to charge at her. She fled the living room. I was going to thank my dad and stepmom for their efforts and not have the party, but I decided to. I was not going to let my stepsister ruin my day, and I know my dad had spent so much on planning the event. My stepmom and I went through my wardrobe and eventually settled for the dress my mom had sent earlier. My quinceañera went well, and my friends and I did have a lot of fun, but I earnestly wished I had worn that blue dress. It was so lovely, and I could not forgive my stepsister for being so mean. I decided I was going to get back at her. After my big event, her mom made her apologize to me at the table during breakfast. I told her I'd accepted her apology and acted as if I had forgiven her. What happened put a strain on my dad and stepmother's relationship, but they eventually moved on too. A month before her prom, my stepsister and her friends had already started to plan for prom. They had saved up many pictures of dresses they could wear on their phones and were very excited about it. I decided that it was my time to plan my big revenge, and I considered stealing her dress or ripping it too. I decided against that. My stepsister was smart, and she could suspect I would plot my revenge and hide her dress. Plus, it would be very obvious that I did it. I couldn't think of anything until the day of her prom. Her best friend was getting ready with her in our house, and they hadn't eaten all day because they wanted to look good in their dresses. My stepsister is allergic to onions. I remember this from the first time we met at her mom's birthday party. Her brother had mistakenly eaten onions, and his face and tongue swelled up so bad that their aunt had to rush them to the hospital. It was then that my stepsister told me that she was also allergic to onions and that their dad was too. Armed with that information, I went down to the kitchen and started to make a salad. The makeup artist came over and helped my stepsister and her friends get ready. When their dates came over to pick them up, I heard my stepmom wearing them down to eat something. You ladies have to eat something, even if it's just grapes. They both came into the kitchen. Wow, you look gorgeous, I exclaimed. They thanked me and giggled. My stepmom was behind them, trying to make sure they ate something. I don't want you having sodas or alcohol on an empty stomach. They say, calm down, Mom, we won't be drinking alcohol. My stepmom rolled her eyes. Would you like some salad? I asked my stepsister's best friend. Thank you, she said, and I served her a small portion. I expected that my stepsister would ask for a portion too if she saw her friend eating, but she grabbed her best friend's portion and started to eat it. How typical, I thought to myself. Her best friend laughed awkwardly and I served her another portion. The two ladies and their dates hurried away before stepmom could take more pictures of them. I'll admit that at some point, I worried that my plan wouldn't succeed because nothing happened. Perhaps there weren't enough onions in it. I'd cut the onions into very tiny pieces so she wouldn't notice right off the bat. About 10 minutes later, they returned. My stepsister's best friend called very loudly for my stepmom, and we both rushed outside to see my stepsister screaming. It was a funny scene because her tongue was badly swollen, so she couldn't even scream. She was just making a very funny noise. I could not help chuckling, but she noticed it and grabbed my hair. My stepmom and her date pulled her away from me. She kept trying to tell her mom that I did it, but she couldn't speak, so she just started to cry. My stepmom rushed back inside to get her purse and drove her back to the hospital, while her date and best friend went back for prom. For someone like my stepsister, she was devastated. I'm certain she looked forward to stealing the show at prom, and she had a good chance of doing that in her lovely dress, makeup, and accessories. I spent that night laughing hysterically. Luckily, I was home alone, so no one heard me. When they returned from the hospital, she tried again to attack me, but her mom held her back, and I ran to my room and shut the door. The next day, my dad asked what happened. I told him I'd made myself some salad and offered it to her friend. She didn't have to take some of it, but she did. I also lied about not knowing that she was allergic to onions. My dad assured my stepmother that I could never have done that, and she believed him. I was a good kid after all, and had given them no reason to think I could have done it. To this day, my stepsister keeps telling everyone she saw me laughing, but no one believes her. Do you guys think that regardless of what they've done to you, that allergies are something you should not use as a form of revenge? Like, depending on how bad that allergy was, it could have been life-threatening. I mean, they went to the hospital. So do you guys think that this revenge OP took out on their stress-ruining, backstabbing stepsister was justified? Or do you guys think OP crossed some lines they really just shouldn't have? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And our final story of the day is exposing my awful father. Before I begin to explain how crappy my father is, I'll say the names and ages of everyone in my family. I'm the oldest girl at 18 and I have 3 younger siblings. My brother, we'll call him C, is 17. The sister just after him, let's call her A, is 10. The baby of the house is 5, and thankfully we've been able to protect him from a lot of the things we faced when we were younger. My brother C and I were born to my parents when they were in their mid-20s and living in a much better situation. They had easier lives and things just worked out for them. They had their own house, hosted nice parties, and were still friends with their college friends, who were always in attendance. They also had really good jobs that paid well. Somehow, the wheels of fate turned on them and things started to go really bad, really fast. Large sums of money were lost, someone forgot to pay the mortgage, and the house was taken away. All of their friends were suddenly too busy to help them out with favors. And they had 2 screaming toddlers who still needed to be looked at 24/7. They eventually had to move to a different town, sell a lot of their belongings, and take loans to be able to get a smaller but livable house. Of course, we as their children had no idea that this was going on with our parents. All we knew how to do was eat, mess things up, and sleep. We were forced to grow up a little quicker than we should have. Our mother was able to find a job, but it was harder for our dad because he considered himself an intellectual and was too good to work manual service jobs that paid less than minimum wage. He tried for higher up jobs, but the problem with getting them was that you needed to live in a more expensive neighborhood and at least have a car to get to them, neither of which my father did. So he was stuck in the same cycle of applying to jobs over and over again, but not getting any kind of positive response from them. He was advised by my mother to start small with the service jobs, but he was adamant about trying for something that would get us out of the situation we were in just a few months. It didn't work out, and that eventually depressed him enough that he turned to alcohol as his vice, and left my poor mother to handle things on her own. As the first child, I became the official caretaker of myself and my brother as soon as I turned 7, collecting food stamps and almost expired cans of food from the back of grocery stores, preparing easy lunches like sandwiches and ordering pizza when my mother didn't come home on time, and occasionally my father's beer and cigarettes. I learned to cut coupons and spot good 2-for-1 deals to make our lives easier. It was a pretty good dynamic that we had, until a year later when my mother fell pregnant with our 3rd sibling. It felt like a breath of fresh air, and everyone else was happy, but my father was filled with so much rage, not wanting my mother to carry another child. As young as I was, even I knew that the situation of things was not very good. They also didn't do a good job at hiding their arguments. So I heard all of his attempts to get my mother to get rid of the baby because it would stop her from working. She refused to listen to him, which caused a lot more fights between them, fights that turned physical sometimes. Our mother is a stubborn woman, so she didn't listen to my father and continued to work and provide for the family until a week before she was due to give birth. After she had my sister, my father had to take up more responsibility because she had to heal. It annoyed him that he had to do something responsible for once, especially as he'd been on his butt for so long. And although he did get a job, he was a major jerk to us at home and put it in our faces whenever he could that he worked for the money now and could do whatever he wanted, which included buying copious amounts of alcohol and getting wasted nearly every night. We knew that we didn't have much of a choice, so we continued to live under his tyranny so that he wouldn't get mad or drunk enough to hit us one day. A few months after our mother had recovered from childbirth, she went job hunting again and found an even better job opportunity than her last one and got started immediately. From a young age, she let us know that the only reason she tried so hard to get a job was for financial freedom. It was a good mentality to have, and it definitely saved us when my father decided to abandon us after my mom got pregnant with our youngest sibling. There was no sign, as he was being his normal, jerky self to us one day, and then the next day, he was gone. We tried to look for him, but soon we realized that he'd made off with a few of his most prized possessions. There was no way he was kidnapped if he remembered to take his favorite jacket and boots along with him. I was old enough to get a job to support the family, and so I did. It was hard, I'll have to admit, but my mother had managed to make us understand that we didn't have it easy and we had to work. Sure, we still had our differences as a family, but we knew how to put it all aside when we needed each other. The few months following my father's elopement were the hardest, and we had basically no family living around us. My mother was an orphan child, and my father had just one brother that he didn't speak to run to when we needed help. And our mom had way too much pride to ask anyone for any sort of help. I worked 2 jobs and my brother worked one just to make sure we could pay the bills and have hot dinners and breakfasts. It was a lot for a 16-year-old me, but I powered through for my family. Sometime last year, the universe seemed to smile down at us, and my mother got a job as a virtual assistant for a huge company. I managed to graduate high school and was promoted to assistant manager at one of my jobs, while my brother entered senior year and also took over my former position. We had enough money to move into a better house, and so we did. For the first time in a while, we didn't have to worry about the electricity getting cut off, or if we would have enough to eat. We weren't rich, a little far from it even, but we were pretty comfortable. The baby of the house was turning 4, and we decided to throw a birthday party for him. His birthday coincidentally falls at the same time as Thanksgiving, so it's usually one of the only things that we celebrate. The other being Christmas. Friends from school, work, and the neighborhood made their way up to our house to celebrate with us, and we were generally having a good time until he showed up. After 3.5 years with no contact, my father somehow found our new house out, and he showed up at our little brother's birthday party / Thanksgiving celebration, looking as if he were about to pass out on the next second. His clothes were dirty, and he looked as if he had trekked 3 states to get to us. My brother C and I's initial response was to kick him out and ask him to never return, but my mother was against it. She told us to be kind and decided to end the party just to hear him out. We were still hesitant, but we did as she asked. Now, something you should know about my father is that he is literally the most manipulative man on earth. He is a narcissist and loves to take advantage of people. As tough as my mother thought she was, even after these years, my father still knew how to get to her. And in no time, she had tears in her eyes at his stupid sob story. C and I couldn't believe our ears. We tried to talk my mother out of her decision, but it was like our father had put a film over her eyes and made her immune to common sense. No one liked him around the house, not even the little 4-year-old, and he liked everyone. We, the kids, soon found out that our father had no plans of getting in our own good books. He was slobbery, lazy, and messed up things deliberately, so that when we tried to complain about him to our mother, it seemed like we were making things hard for him on purpose. We were eventually able to settle into a dynamic for the peace of our mother, showing respect and pretending not to notice some of the annoying things he did. As the days passed, our father seemed to actually want things to work with our mom, so he started to be very sweet to her, getting her flowers and promising to be a better man for her. We, the kids, had not started to warm up to him yet, but pretended to for our mother's sake. He even said that he got a job down at the local warehouse as a loader, and we all believed him, until our mother sent us to give him lunch one afternoon, and we found out that there was nobody with his name that worked there. It was at that moment that we knew that we needed to figure out exactly what he was doing when he told us that he went to work. Since he and I had work in the daytime, we asked our 10-year-old sister to sneakily follow him around until she figured out where he was going. She's a very smart kid, so it didn't prove a chore to her. Plus he, our father, was always the last to leave the house. A discovered that our father went to different addresses nearly every day of the week, and she noted them down. Unfortunately, before she could do more for our little investigation, someone reported to our mother that she wandered too far from home and she got grounded. C and I took on the job, and we found out that our father, who had basically been love bombing my mother for almost an entire month, was cheating on her with some of the people that were supposed to be her friends. We were determined to expose the lot of them to our mother, but we needed concrete evidence. So I bought and planted a small microphone on the jacket that he wore every day, and it was connected to my system so I could have access to the audio files. Christmas was coming up, and we had the most perfect present to give him. For the days leading up to Christmas, we pretended that everything was normal and kept ourselves very busy so that we would not spill the surprise before the designated time. On Christmas Eve, we put a flash drive filled with audio and picture evidence of our father's infidelity inside the presents that he got for her, and we waited for her to open it. Our mother didn't open the flash drive till later that night, but when she did, she and our father had a huge fight, which resulted in him being kicked out of the house. We were glad that she finally saw how he was cheating on her with 3 of the women that were supposed to be her friends while pretending to work and instead stealing from her money to buy her things. It was sick and twisted of him, and honestly, we were just happy that our mother had finally seen the truth, but she had other plans for revenge against him. She first filed for divorce, and then brought up the fact that he abandoned her while pregnant and made her work too. The trial was long and exhausting, but he got ordered by the court to pay a large sum of money as compensation to her. The pictures that were in the flash drive, alongside the audio, were published on Facebook for all to see, and my mother's 3 former friends were exposed as cheaters. It's been a little over 7 months since the divorce, and my mother's dating again. Although her ex-husband still tries to speak to her from time to time, she's much wiser now, thanks to her children. I think this actually highlights a good point about if you care for someone or you were or are in love with somebody, a lot of times you can convince yourself that going around on this carousel again, this next time's going to work out and it's going to be perfect and they're going to change. Sometimes it's hard to stop believing in that carousel improving the next time around until you finally see the hard-hitting proof that that carousel is never going to just magically get better. Is the revenge of my former life. I read a story on here a while ago that made me feel like I should tell what happened to me. I don't know if this qualifies as nuclear revenge, but here goes. For reasons that will eventually become obvious, this is a throwaway account, and I haven't used any real names. I've changed a lot of the details of the story, but I try to keep the critical things intact. I'm not trying to be arrogant or full of myself when I say this, but I did very well in school, like the top of my class well. There was one other guy in my school who I regularly competed with, but by the time we graduated, there was a considerable gap between us. It's not as if he wasn't smart enough or lazy. He had 2 friends who weren't at our level academically, but they may well have been joined at the hip. One of them, who I'll call Jock, was an all-star athlete. He was the complete package. Football, basketball, track, and varsity all the way. And a top-tier bunghole. The other one was the class president, Mr. Affable. My daddy has connections that make Verizon look like a telegram company. I'll refer to him as Smirk. My rival was the brains of that trio, so I'll refer to him as Books. Books was a petty son of a gun and would often devise ways of using his latest second-place ranking against me as a reason to harass me. Jock was usually involved in either physically accosting me or holding me down while Books did something humiliating to me. Smirk was never directly involved. It wasn't a good look, but they watched from the fringes, never lifting a finger to stop them. This went on until we graduated, and I took the first scholarship out of town to get as far away from them as possible. I'm an analytical, detail-oriented introvert, so I went for the only career that made sense. I became a CPA. I was good at it and I worked harder than anyone else I knew. I had reconnected with a girl from school over social media and we hit it off pretty well. We decided to get married, so I went home for the first time since leaving high school, but she moved in with me because I wasn't going to stay there. I was working for a large financial institution when the market collapsed. We had a good life. To be more precise, my wife had gotten used to the good life. We had a nice house, my children went to good schools, and we could afford vacations away. My wife didn't take it well when things became very tight. She hadn't worked in years and wasn't willing to get a job to help out. She said that because I was the man, I had to provide, and since I wasn't doing it, I wasn't a real man. I was sure that she was going to leave me because we were weeks away from losing our house. Then one day I ran into Books. I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and I bumped into him at the lowest point of my life. That made our meeting even worse, as he was actually very decent towards me and invited me to lunch. His life was on the uptrend, which became apparent when lunch was at a place only my clients could afford. He and Jock had gone into business. Jock was using his reputation from having a semi-decent sports career to get clients, while Books was running the company. He actually apologized to me for how he treated me and asked if there was any way he could make it up to me. I didn't want anything from him. A nice lunch and an apology wasn't going to change the past, no matter how much he had changed. I made the mistake of telling my wife about the lunch meeting, and she jumped on my neck, saying I should call him and tell him that I needed a job. I said no, but after a week of her camping in my ear, I gave Books a call and said if he knew anyone looking for a CPA with my experience, I'd be glad for just an interview. He got quiet for a moment, and then asked how I'd feel if we did an interview right then and there. It turns out their CFO had died a few weeks ago and they'd been struggling to replace him. The former CFO was actually his dad, and the reason they couldn't replace him was because there wasn't anyone they knew that they could trust. Books trusted me and said that he talked to Jock, but he was sure they could take me on. He got back to me the next day and said if I was willing to start that week, they'd cover our moving costs and put us in a company house until we were settled. My wife practically pushed me out the door saying she'd handle things. She sold our house at a loss and packed up our life while I moved back to heal my childhood traumas. At least that's how my wife saw it because she knew everything those guys put me through in high school. When I arrived, I was immediately put to work. Jock and Books were running the kind of business that allows them to import and export things as well as manufacture products. So there are plenty of legitimate reasons for the company to be doing business internationally. If meeting Books again was awkward, meeting Jock again was just plain weird. He didn't apologize or anything, but he rarely made eye contact with me. Luckily, he wasn't around the business much, so I didn't have to deal with him often. Their business was doing well. They had a few good clients, and there was a steady stream of contracts from the state coming their way. I got a very nice salary, and we were able to get a house that was better than the one we sold. That first weekend when my wife arrived, we were invited to a dinner party with Jock and Books as well as their wives. It was as if my wife had died and gone to heaven. These people had money, in-house chefs kind of money. They spent the whole night telling us how much we were going to love it, all the yacht trips and wine country visits we were going to go on together. I really wasn't into all of that, but my wife was happy and she made friends with Books and Jock's wives because we were spending a lot of time together. As much as I hate to admit it, after a while they became my friends as well. Our history just vanished over the course of a year. That in itself was not a reason to see red flags. I was glad to be a part of a clique, and so as far as my personal life was concerned, I was pretty much blind to reality. But after a year, there was one red flag I never picked up for which I completely take the blame. Accountants and pimps have a lot in common. We have a unique dress sense particular to our profession. We're surrounded by women who despise us but still depend on us. And most of all, we spend the majority of our time calling people asking them, "Where's my money?" In the first year of working for Books and Jock, I've never had a client that paid late. Every single one of them paid on time. A lot of them even paid early. That was a major red flag. There is no legitimate business under the sun that doesn't have clients who don't pay them late. And after more than a decade of doing books, it's something you plan for. The first month I got there, I was so relieved to just have a job. I just thought we were having a great month. The month after that, I thought it was luck. By the third month, I'd moved into a new house, bought a new car, and had been having such a good time that I didn't recognize the anomaly. I'm ashamed to say that even after a year, I didn't pick it up, but there's parts of every professional's job that they do automatically because it's ingrained in them. For me, it was my annual KYC and PEP checks. Because we were dealing with a lot of international clients and we had contracts with the state, I had to make sure that we were still coloring in the lines as far as our financial transactions were concerned. A KYC is an anti-fraud and anti-money laundering procedure. It stands for Know Your Customer. Banks and large investment firms use it to make sure that the Nigerian prince they're dealing with is actually a Nigerian prince. PEP stands for Politically Exposed Person, which means that the person you're dealing with is either a family member or are themselves a politically connected person. People like this are at a higher risk of bribery and corruption, so dealing with them is a cautious affair. The reason I ran these checks annually is that sometimes international companies might have a change of ownership, like a private factory suddenly becoming a state-owned enterprise. Then our dealings with them have to change financially in terms of our reporting, because it's not a good look if we're buying two-way radios from the Chinese government and supplying it to the state for their security guards. When I started the process of running the checks, red flags rained from the sky. The first flag was that the KYC or PEP checks done when our clients were onboarded were bogus. Book's dad was not incompetent in the least, he was also a CPA, and the records I got when I took over were immaculate. So I couldn't think of a reason why he would be so sloppy. So I discreetly began doing checks on our business as well as our clients. Apart from the state, almost all of our other clients were subsidiaries owned by subsidiaries. And that included ourselves. We were owned by some of our clients. Jocks and Books Company were part of a group that they owned along with one other person. The moment I figured out who he was, I knew I was in deep trouble. Smirk had made good use of his daddy's connections and managed to become a member of the state legislature. He then used his influence there to get fat contracts for the group of companies him and his buddies own. The problem I was stuck with was that I didn't know who was on the other end of these businesses we were dealing with. At the very least, I suspected we were dealing with fraud and corruption. Every other evil imaginable was on the other end of the spectrum. Of course, as life would have it, all of this was the least of my concerns. My wife had gotten very used to this life and her new rich friends, so there was no way she was going to give it up willingly, but I had to be sure. I knew that she talked to the other guys' wives about everything, so I had to be very circumspect about what I was suggesting. I took her out to a nice dinner and just generally talked about what we'd been through and how lucky we were to have ended up where we are. I told her that even though we were much better off than before, I sometimes wished for a simpler life. Maybe open a small practice. She did what most women do in situations like this. She ignored me, but keep pressing the issue. I start saying how I wasn't happy anymore and that I wanted my own thing. I didn't want to work for somebody else for the rest of my life. She looked me in the eye and flat out told me that if I quit this job, she would leave me. She said that she didn't go through all the trouble of getting me this job just for me to take her back to being poor. I had no idea what she was talking about, and I couldn't have cared less that we were in public. But I politely reminded her that I was the one who went to school and became a CPA. I got this job because I was qualified for it. That's when she dropped the bomb. After I left town, she and Books dated for a while, but they still remained friends after they broke up and kept in touch. So when we were about to lose our house, she asked him to help me out with a job and even told him where he could bump into me. She set it up so that I could have this job, and as far as she was concerned, she earned at least half of what I was making. That was all I needed to hear. I knew that she was going to tell Books about our conversation, so I just waited for that call. When it came, I was ready. I met with Books and Jock at one of their houses and told them that I was hurt. I said that even though we had put our past behind us, it felt wrong that they were leaving me out of the bigger part of the business. I explained that I was simply going through the business due diligence when I found out we were part of a group. I said that since they didn't want to include me in the bigger business, I thought it was best if I went and started my own thing to be my own boss. There is one thing you can count on in life, and that's greedy people thinking that other people are as greedy as they are. They immediately saw this as an opportunity to get me willfully in their pockets, so they offered me a stake in the large business. With what I had in mind, I didn't want to be a part of this sinking ship, so I decided to reward my wife for her generous role in getting me involved with these people. I suggested to her that I didn't want her to worry about her future in case something happened to me, that I wanted her to have the best life money can buy, so I suggested that she be the one to have the shares in the group. She was more than happy, and her ex-boyfriend didn't object. We put up the house as collateral to buy into all the companies, and the loan was to be paid off with the dividends from the shares. Once all the paperwork was finished, I started the hard part of my scheme. I'd used the intervening months to gather as much information as I could about who our clients actually were. I was both glad and terrified about what I learned. Terrified because these were the kind of people who make politicians disappear, but glad because it meant that I would justify my actions when the time came. Now here's a free lesson in accounting and fraud. Human beings are imperfect. Even with the best software in the world, people pay late, make mistakes, and even display catastrophic incompetence over the simplest of things. So remember this, if you ever come across someone's books that are perfect, I mean absolutely perfect, they're cooking those books. Book's dad was smart, and he knew this, so he intentionally allowed mistakes and errors to appear in their books. But once I knew what the game was, it was easy to see what was going on. They had set up a group because they needed to shield the payments that they received and made. Let's use the two-way radio example again. Let's say they were getting those radios from the Chinese government, who was using a company that used to be a private entity but is now state-owned. The one company in the group would then sell it to one of the other companies in the group, which would sell it to a third, who would then sell it to the state. That way, the state can claim that they source their product from a local business that sources their things from another local business. This also hinders the money that the state paid for those radios from being traced back to the Chinese government. Awesome! Now that I had access to all the accounts of the group, I was able to make direct payments from the first receiver to the end user and vice versa. So if the state paid us for a contract, instead of running that money through two other companies before it got to China, I paid it straight to China. I did the same for a lot of the other unsavory characters that the company was dealing with. After I'd done a few of those transactions, I began sending anonymous tips to the authorities, telling them to examine some of the transactions that were taking place. What I had hoped they would begin to notice is that the state paid $500,000 on Monday, and then on Tuesday we paid $500,000 to a company owned by the Chinese government or some other nefarious organization. We all know that there's nothing truly anonymous these days, but I made sure that there was some way to trace the tips back to me. And once again, I waited. I honestly expected to be arrested and then have the whole thing blown wide open, and in exchange for immunity, I would testify against all of them. Instead, I got a lunch invitation over Facebook from a friend from college who was in town. I show up at a restaurant, and the waiter tells me which table to go to while I wait for my friend. No big deal. I wait, but they're not showing up. Just as I was about to message them, some guy sits down and puts a badge on the table and tells me to greet him like he was my friend. That was the last thing I was hoping would happen. I knew that even if I gave them all the books and records, it wasn't going to be enough. They were going to want more, and that's exactly what he asked for. He basically threatened me, saying that even though I made the tips, I was also the one who made the payments without the KYC and PEP checks. He even used the T word. He said that they could prove that I funded terrorists. I was just the CPA. There was no way I was getting in the room where the deals were being made. This was also not worth dying over, so I negotiated. It was a terrible deal, but it was the only one with the best chance of me not going to prison or ending up in small pieces in a box. Now, Smirk was no genius, but he was smart enough to not have any direct ownership of any of the companies in the group. Those shares were split 4 ways. The 2 largest portions belonged to Books and Jock. They each had 35%. The tiniest portion belonged to my wife, which was 1%, and the second biggest portion belonged to another company. That company was wholly owned by Smirk. That company had 29%. This gave him enough shares to reap significant benefits, but he was shy of a controlling interest, which meant that his company could claim ignorance of any of the dealings that happened in the group. My job was to get him to implicate himself in the dealings. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was so desperate that I even thought of kidnapping him and forcing him to confess. But luck was on my side and it was an election year. I realized that I was never going to get him to implicate himself, so the next best option was to get him to give up his friends. Unlike them, he wasn't in it for the money. The money was good, but he had family money. He was all about his reputation ever since high school. Going after him directly during an election season was too obvious. I started leaving tips with some of the non-local journalists about the relationships that Books and Jock had and the businesses they were in bed with. This time, I made sure to truly be anonymous. As they dug around the periphery, more and more hyenas started creeping in until the connection was made between the honorable member of the state legislature and his high school buddies. Once that happened, the guys with the badges had no choice but to swoop in and make arrests. The reason? It was going to look really bad for everyone if it became public news that public funds were being used to buy security equipment from a hostile nation's government and other enterprises involved in illicit dealings. But it gets better. Because people needed to go to jail, there had to be a trial. And the only person who had enough evidence and first-hand experience to testify was me. The conditions of my deal were still in place, and I testified. This, of course, led to the company going under and its shareholders losing everything, including my wife. My deal was to go into witness protection. That meant that everything attached to my name couldn't follow me, so the debt that was taken out against my house was no longer my problem, but rather my wife's. This was amplified by the fact that the debt was incurred for the purpose of gaining an asset in her favor. So that bank took the house, and she was left with nothing and still had to pay off the rest of the debt. The three stooges went to prison, but they met unfortunate ends because their other friends didn't want to take the risk of them talking. I was relocated to a place where not only no one knows me, but I'm not allowed to go near anything that resembles my previous profession. All in all, marry for love, not money. Honestly, what else can you do if you get that far into this operation and you realize what exactly is going on here? It's not like something you can just straight up leave, right? If you found out what was actually going on here, would you just try to give everything up? Your relationship, this job, and try to ride off into the sunset and hope it never catches back up to you? Let me know in the comments down below. And our final story of the day is revenge against my snake of an English teacher. I had a bright future, at least that's what my grades in high school indicated. I was well on my way to getting a scholarship that was going to pay for everything. This meant a lot because my family didn't have a lot. My dad had a small business as an exterminator, and that was all we had to support him, my mom, myself, and my 3 younger sisters. I wanted to be a writer, so I started my own blog where I wrote short stories and did some experimental writing, using classical writers as templates and doing spin-offs of their work. I never got any money for it, and I always gave credit to the original source material. At the beginning of my final year of high school, we got an English assignment to come up with a story. This was something I could do in my sleep, and normally I wouldn't have worried too much about it. But my English teacher was the same one I had the previous year, and he despised me. The main reason was that I was an A student in his class that never paid attention. But worse still, I'd correct him from time to time when he got things wrong. He hated me for that and was always looking for a reason to give me fewer marks. Because of that, I had to write the most impeccable story imaginable to fit his ridiculous standards. I spent weeks writing this story and submitted it confident of my next A. I got an F, and I was brought before the school disciplinary committee for plagiarism. Apparently, he thought my story was so good that there was no way that I'd written it. So he plugged it into Copyscape and every other plagiarism check he could find, and found that I indeed did plagiarize some of my story. Some of my elements and even phrases I used in my assignment came from a blog. My blog. I didn't realize that I'd reused some of my old material, but the fact was, it was still my work. Obviously, as a teenager, I wasn't using my real name on my blog, so it looked like I'd stolen someone else's work. It took forever to convince the board that it was my blog. I even had to log in during the hearing so everyone could see that it was my work. I think he already knew that, and the moment I proved it was my blog, he fired his next shot. He started explaining how the kinds of stories I was writing were stealing from classical writers, and that this was just the kind of person I was. It didn't help that I wrote some dark and graphic stories which the committee didn't like. I had a hard time trying to convince them that I was paying homage and experimenting, but my English teacher just kept twisting what I was saying. The school board didn't want any more to do with me, and they also didn't want to have my blog and my writing associated with the school, so they found me guilty and placed it on my academic record. Bye-bye scholarship. No school wanted anything to do with me. I had no choice but to go into the family business. After a few years, I got the hang of it, and I was doing well enough that my dad let me go on some jobs on my own. Where I live, it was common for snakes to randomly show up at places. Most people didn't really have a problem with snakes and could deal with the small ones easily, but the bigger ones sometimes needed an exterminator or pest control to come out. One day, I got a call to deal with a pretty big snake that was found in a small supermarket. I got to the site and handled the snake like a professional. On my way out, I see my old English teacher. He was pale from his hair to his boots. He'd been hiding the whole time, not wanting to see the snake. Who would I be if I didn't take advantage of my enemy's deepest fear? I wasn't going to just take the snake and throw it at him. No, I wanted him to suffer. Over the next few months, I began stockpiling some small animals and other things that attracted the local snakes, as well as some non-poisonous snakes of various sizes that I found. Once I was sure that my collection was adequate, I'd drive past his house and released a few of the smaller animals into his yard. I did this routinely until I was sure there were enough of them that they'd made a habitat for themselves in or around his house. Then I started releasing the smaller snakes. He didn't have anybody living with him, so I wasn't too concerned about children. I knew that he wasn't going to call my dad's business first, but rather go to one of the other exterminators in the area. There wasn't a lot, but he had a few options. Once one of them got rid of the snakes, I'd go back and start the process with slightly bigger rodents and snakes. With the bigger creatures appearing at his house, he called a different exterminator because obviously the previous ones didn't do a proper job. I kept doing this until eventually our phone rang. When I got there, he was a mess. I don't think he'd been sleeping properly or even eating. I listened to him tell me about how these things kept coming back bigger and bigger. I told him to leave the house for a few days while I took care of everything. Over the next few days, I discreetly began modifying his house. I created nests for some of the bigger rodents, as well as areas for the bigger snakes to stay. This included the gap between the bathtub and the floor. I had to take out some of the tiles for that and replace them in such a way that the snakes could just push them loose. I carved a nest inside of his sofa, put one behind the stove and the fridge, and a bunch of other places. He had a geyser in his roof, and I put the biggest snake there, which was just above his bathroom, connected to his bedroom. I called him to tell him he could move back in after I made sure that nothing was too out of place. I don't know what exactly happened. I wasn't there when everything erupted, but from what I heard and saw afterwards, this is what I think happened. Sometime in the middle of the night, the big one fell through the roof and landed on his bed. That he didn't get a heart attack and died was a miracle. He somehow found the strength to run to the bathroom to hide, but the state that the bathroom was in, when I saw it later, suggests that there was some kind of fight. After that, he ran out of the house into the street screaming his head off. At least that's what I heard from his neighbors. Apparently he was sent somewhere with cushioned rooms and self-hugging jackets. The fact is, I never heard of or saw him again after that. I do kind of doubt that this guy was locked up and thrown in the loony bin, but I am willing to bet that this guy probably just packed up and dropped just about everything if they're that deadly afraid of snakes. Imagine it's the worst fear of your life, and all of a sudden your house in every room is erupting with that fear. This dude probably just left everything behind and straight up dipped out of town. Is all three of us get revenge against our boyfriend. I've never really told this story to anyone besides my best friends, but I think you're going to want to hear it. I'm a 26-year-old female, and just before my 25th birthday last year, I got into my first adult relationship. Now, I know what you're thinking. How come I had to turn 25 before getting into a relationship? Wasn't it weird being single for so long? Well, I grew up as the fat child in the neighborhood. My parents were free-spirited hippies who were obsessed with my chubby cheeks and felt like my happiness was referenced in my size. They weren't exactly wrong because I was the happiest child back then. Growing up around family and friends that loved and adored me was the best thing. Our family was doing well and living on a farm that had been passed down through generations. And there was no real need for money as we had most of what we needed already with us. We grew most of our own food and my father was the best cook in the world. Plus, my grandparents stayed not too far from us, so I had my entire family close to me. My mother was a homeschooler, so I learned at home until I turned 11. That was when a lot of things started to go badly at home. My father got scammed so terribly by his friend and lost everything we owned. We went from having everything we needed to needing to depend on strangers for food to eat. I didn't understand the situation until my parents took me to stay with my grandparents and told me that they had to go and work to be able to provide for me again. I was very sad for a long time. But my grandparents tried their hardest to make me feel better. They couldn't continue with my homeschooling because they had work that made them unavailable, so I had to start going to a real school. I absolutely hated it, by the way. I started middle school in the middle of the semester, so things started out very awkward for me. And as a child who had been homeschooled, I was very shy around people my age. But a lot of them didn't understand that and thought I was just snobbish and rude. I entered junior high with no friends and the nickname Chunky, and despite ignoring the comments, they got to me. My grandparents already had so much that they were going through, taking care of me and providing for me, so I felt like it was pointless to worry them with the things that were my problems. Plus, all these people weren't actually physically hurting me, so I brushed it completely off and set my mind on finishing high school. I did get out of high school on the honors list and got scholarships to all my dream Ivy League schools that I applied to. By the time I was moving into college, my grandparents had retired and moved cities, and my parents had started to come back into my life. But this time, they weren't the same people I remembered. They had become very religious and critical, yelling at my grandparents for letting me get so fat. It was one thing to have bullies who I had no personal connection with tease me for being fat, but it was an entirely different thing to have my parents do it, especially as I'd imagined reuniting with them a little less differently. In my head, there would have been a lot of happy tears, hugs, and affirmations of how much we missed each other, but there was none of that. Instead, my father was eerily quiet, pretending like I didn't exist, and my mother criticized everything I did, down to the way I walked. I realized pretty soon that my parents weren't the same people I used to know anymore. It made me sad, but it also made me work harder at university and take on a couple of jobs so that I would never have to move back in with them again. I made my first couple of friends at the university, and it was really nice. It felt like we'd been friends forever, and like I had a family that accepted me for who I was without criticism. We had a lot in common, except for the fact that I had never dated anyone. I had never had a love interest, never kissed anyone, never spoken to a guy for more than 10 seconds. My friends weren't very judgmental about it, but they did think I was a prude and tried not to talk about their escapades around me. With time, it graduated to them trying to matchmake me with different guys, but it hardly ever worked out because they all wanted sex and I wanted romance and fireworks. All the good stuff that romance novels seem to sell. Eventually, I gave up on the prospect of romance and went through university single and without even having my first kiss. After university, I got a really good job based on a professor's recommendation and started work immediately. Driven by my need for independence, I put all my concentration and effort into my job, only making time for my friends and occasionally my family. After a while of working my butt off, I got promoted at work and my workload was reduced. I also got a new place and a dog. I felt like I'd gotten everything I wanted and I was finally ready to date someone. But at this time, it seemed like there were no men that were attracted to me. I went on blind dates that my friends set me up on and never got called back by them, and even tried dating apps. But they all left me lonelier and more frustrated than before. All of the insecurities I managed to bury started coming back. Was it because of my size, or did I just not seem like the girlfriend type? My friends said that it was because the men were intimidated by the fact that I was a career woman, but I didn't believe them. I deemed myself unattractive and gave up on dating completely. After a while, I completely pretended to forget about dating and focused on other things. Just 2 months before my 25th birthday, I was on the train when it came to an abrupt stop. I lost my balance and fell into the arms of the most handsome man I had ever seen. He smiled at me and helped me up, and for the rest of the trip, we were train buddies. He asked for my number, and by the time we got to our destinations, I was floored by his charm. My train buddy and I talked non-stop the entire weekend, and I found out that we stayed in the same city. We were also on the same train to a work convention. Although we worked in different companies, it somehow happened in the same place. It seemed like a match made in heaven, and I couldn't get enough of the attention that he showered me with. He knew all the right words to say and all the right gestures to do, and he always found a way to make me feel beautiful and strong and empowered without making me feel bad about it. We went on a couple of dates, and a week before I turned 25, he asked me to be his girlfriend. I was elated because this was going to be my first relationship, and it was with such a perfect man. My friends were very excited for me, and they even did some background checks on him and found nothing incriminating. On my birthday, he got me a really beautiful necklace and put it on me. Later, he kissed me under the full moon and kept telling me how perfect and beautiful he found me. He had no idea that he was my first kiss, but I did. It could not have been more perfect. We hooked up not too long after that, and it was magical and good. It felt like after so long of feeling undesired, my special someone had come to make me feel like the only girl in the world, literally. I didn't know how relationships were supposed to go, but our relationship was great and I was content. To my friends, things seemed to be moving too fast because I moved in with them after 3 months of dating, but I didn't think so. I should have listened to them. We settled into a dynamic where I worked and came home earlier to make dinner ready for him, and he just ate and ordered me around. I liked to do whatever he wanted because he showered me in love when he was happy with me. By the 5-month mark of our relationship, I was always feeling exhausted because I had no time to myself. After all, I was constantly taking care of my boyfriend. My friends tried to talk to me about how I was a slave to my boyfriend, but I chose not to listen. They didn't understand how much I wanted to make the relationship work, no matter what it took. My boyfriend's attitude towards me got worse by the 7th month because he didn't even act as if I existed at all. He went away for days on end, didn't call or text me, and when I tried to complain, he would rant endlessly about how work was trying to kill him and I was doing the same. He always made me feel guilty for asking for something as small as paying the bills in his own house, so I took up the role of caretaker. On a random night out with my friends, I complained to them, and they suggested that my boyfriend might be cheating. I decided to investigate for myself later, picking up his phone and going through it later while he slept, and I found that he was cheating on me with 2 other women. The worst part of it was that these women had no idea that they were being 2-timed by this man. I felt a lot of rage for him, and I decided that I would let the other women know. I took their numbers from his phone and messaged them at a later time, telling them of the situation, all while still pretending to him like things were okay. Both of the women, we'll call them X and Y, were very upset about the situation and wanted to confront him, but I decided against it. Instead, I convinced them not to do it just yet. Maybe if we let him on just a little more before finally exposing his ways, it would be a little more fun. They agreed instantly, and we decided to meet with each other. The first thing I noticed about both women was that they were very pretty, and I felt as if I paled in comparison to them. The second thing I noticed was that all 3 of us had brown hair and were plus-sized women. It almost seemed like he was acting based on a fetish, which was weird but not surprising. X was the youngest of us all and had just graduated from college. Y was in her mid-30s and fresh out of a divorce. And I was a lonely woman who had never dated anyone else before. Another thing that we had in common was the fact that we were all needy in some way, and he just so happened to be in the right place at the right time. We also found out that he'd been lying to us for a while, and each one of us was dealing with one of his living essentials. I paid the bills, cleaned his house, and fed him. Y helped him out financially, and he just used X for hooking up. X, Y, and I got closer as we teamed up against our lying scoundrel of a boyfriend. He was still a jerk to me, but I pretended not to notice, being overly nice to him and still making his meals. I employed a trick from one of my favorite movies and put estrogen supplements in his food to mess with his hormones and make him grow a chest too. I also stopped paying his bills on time and pretended to be completely oblivious to everything until he gave up and paid them himself. Because of his estrogen supplements I started adding to his food, he wasn't able to get it up to hook up with X, which left him feeling very ashamed of himself. Y also found a way to tell him that she was having some serious financial issues and couldn't send him money anymore. He threw a tantrum, and we three girls laughed about it later. To him, it was like his cover was falling apart. It was getting a little expensive to be with three women at the same time, especially since none of us were giving him any money. He was losing hair, growing boobs, and losing his charm. It was very fun to watch. On the eve of what was supposed to be his and I's first relationship anniversary, and a week to my 26th birthday, I invited him out to dinner in a fancy restaurant. It was going well until I said that I had to go to the bathroom and came back out with X and Y. He looked shocked. I still wish to this day that I got a picture of his face. While he stuttered and tried to understand what was going on, the girls and I ordered dinner, ate to our fill, and left him there in the restaurant. We all broke up with him over text and went off to celebrate at a bar nearby. It felt like a huge weight had been lifted off all of our shoulders. I moved back to my old apartment and picked up my things from my now ex-boyfriend's apartment with the help of my friends, just before he had to move back in with his mother because there were no more women to fund his extravagant lifestyle anymore. After the incident, I blocked every contact with him, but I'm still very good friends with both women, and we keep in touch from time to time. Okay, first of all, do you guys think OP was going way over the line slipping estrogen supplements into his food? Second of all, if you found out that you and two other people were simultaneously being cheated on, would you ever consider being friends with them? Let me know what you guys think about both these things down in the comments below. And our final story of the day is ex-boyfriend pays for my shopping spree. My ex-boyfriend cheated on me numerous times with his ex-wife, and I got my revenge by going on a shopping spree with my daughter using his credit card. Well, here's how it happened. About a year ago, I met my ex at the gym I frequent, and we fell in love. Or so I thought. His story? He was a recent divorcee, and I was the first woman he dated after his divorce. He said his wife left him for a richer and older dude and that he was heartbroken when it happened, but was ready to move on and to be with someone else. We went on a couple of dates and he was a perfect gentleman, kind and attentive. I was crazy about him. We started to hang out more, and after 3 months he asked to meet my daughter. I didn't typically introduce men to my daughter because I didn't feel the need to. If it's not a serious relationship, I just did not see why I should do that. I'd only ever introduced one man to my daughter since I started dating again, and since that didn't work out, I decided I was going to take my time before exposing my daughter to another man. Well, he pressured me quite hard, so I eventually gave in. I invited him to my home for dinner and he met my daughter. She was not particularly nice towards him, but she wasn't cold either. She welcomed him well, but was mostly silent all through the meal. I understood that she was observing him and decided I'd let her take her time and let him grow on her. In no time, he expressed his wish for us to make our relationship official and started to spend most of his time in my home. Things were moving quite fast, and I worried that I was just a rebound following his divorce. But my ex-boyfriend assured me that I wasn't, and added that he had mentally checked out of his marriage years before it officially ended. Months later, we decided to move in together, and it made sense that I moved into his home since he had a larger house, one that would accommodate my teenage daughter too. I knew it was way too fast to move in with a man that I'd known for just 5 months, but I was excited to be coupled up again. I'd been widowed for 6 years, and only started actively dating the year before. Yes, I'd gone on a couple of dates and all, but I never really liked any of these men, or sometimes they never really liked me, or they would have called me again. When I met my ex-boyfriend though, it was different because he wasn't reluctant to lock it down. Most men wanted to keep it casual forever, but he was happy to be exclusive and start a life together. Also, he seemed like a very cool guy and we were crazy about each other. I considered that it would be nice for my daughter to have a father figure around because since her dad died, it's just been us. My brother would have been more than happy to perform that role, but he moved to France with his family after his wife was offered a huge job in fashion. I figured my daughter would be happy for me when I broke the news about us seriously considering moving in together, but she wasn't. She was very skeptical, and it irritated me. She could see how his presence in my life made me very happy, and she was not happy about that? Well, Mom, I know if it were me in your shoes, you wouldn't want me moving in with him, she said and left for her room. I understood that, and I agreed with her, but things are not always so simple. People date for years and then move in together and things get messy, so it's not always a terrible thing to step on the acceleration a little bit in a romantic relationship. Also, moving in with him will certainly help our finances. It'd be great to have someone to share bills with for a change. My ex-boyfriend is a principal in a private school, and he made more money than I did. I had made up my mind to move in with my ex-boyfriend, but it was important for me to get my daughter on board. The next day, before she stepped out of the car in school, I calmly explained to her why it was important for me to date and how it would be of great advantage to us both. I even mentioned that she would finally get the big room that she'd always wanted and would live in a house with a pool. I expected a little excitement, but she just rolled her eyes at me, muttered, "Whatever," and banged the car door behind her. I was annoyed at her childish behavior. Children can be such ungrateful monsters, I thought. I've always put her happiness before mine, and now that I was getting the chance to be happy, she's mad about it? I had ran into my ex-boyfriend, and he'd hugged and assured me she'd eventually come around. Yes, we moved in with my boyfriend 2 weeks after that, and my daughter's bigger room did excite her. My ex-boyfriend had provided her with different pictures of a room decor to choose from, and she picked a nice design. She seemed very happy, and even happier when she met my ex-boyfriend's daughter, who's just a year older than her. The two hit it off and became friends. My ex's daughter lives with her mother, but she comes over every weekend, and we all hang out together. My expectation was that my daughter would come to love my ex-boyfriend, and hopefully start to respect him as a father in her life. But that was not the case. She suddenly became very disrespectful towards him. She would rudely interrupt him whenever he spoke, roll her eyes at him, and sometimes even refuse to respond to his greetings. I didn't know what to do, and I felt that my daughter was acting up because she was worried her father was being replaced or that my ex and I would decide to start a family and she would be left out. I tried to speak to her about her attitude many times, but she would just shrug it off or say something about not trusting my ex. This bothered me, so I decided to speak to my brother about it. He has a good relationship with her anyway, and if anyone could make her listen, it was him. I was really happy in my relationship, and I would hate for my daughter to ruin what I had going on for me with her bad attitude and teenage exuberance. That night, I intimated my ex of my plans to call my brother and ask him to speak to her, but he persuaded me not to. She'll come around, he promised. I decided not to. The day after that, I made a nice meal for dinner and waited patiently for my ex to return from work so we could all eat together. My daughter was irritated and kept sulking about having to wait for him. It's always good to eat with family, I pointed out, but she was not having it. "Well, he's not my family," she yelled and ran upstairs. At this point, I was very worried and needed to talk to someone. I'd hoped that my ex, my daughter, and I would have a more comfortable, happier life, but that dream kept going farther and farther from my reach. There and then, I decided to call my brother. I was upset and teary and he caught on. I begged him to speak to his niece. I had had enough of her childishness. He promised to speak to her, and I told him to encourage her to tell me what exactly the problem was. There was no way I'd fix the problem if I didn't know what it was. My ex didn't return that day, so I was pretty disoriented about that and my daughter's increased strange and rude behavior. The next day, my ex came home with no reasonable excuse for why he was away, but I somehow figured he wasn't willing to sit through another dinner and put up with my daughter's attitude. I could not wait for her to tell my brother just why she was acting up, so I could finally understand what was going on. My daughter and I certainly do not always see eye to eye on all issues, but we've always been able to talk through all our issues in the past. At work, I called my brother to ask him what was wrong. "You need to talk to her," was his response. "I'm afraid what you need to know must be heard from her." I became terrified. I had read and heard many stories of men hitting on and abusing their stepdaughters. What if that situation was going on in my home? I felt horrible. I'd failed my daughter if that was happening, and she didn't feel comfortable enough with me to talk to me about it. Growing up, my aunt told me about her abusive stepdad. He was a church bishop, and no one believed when she told them that he'd been sexually abusing her, including her mother. I felt then that her mother, my grandmother, must have been a horrible mom. But here I was as a mother too, worrying if my 15-year-old daughter's rebellious behavior had anything to do with my ex doing that kind of stuff to her. I rushed to school immediately after work, and we had a silent ride home. So many things ran through my mind as I drove, and immediately after we got home, I told her to spill. She said, "What?" I said, "Well, what's going on? Has my boyfriend done something to you? Did he touch you inappropriately?" Her eyes widened. "What? Mom, no." I say, "Then what is it? Why are you so bitter towards him? Would you rather I don't have a boyfriend?" She says, "No." I say, "No?" She says, "Mom, I don't have a problem with you having a boyfriend, but I have a problem with him." I say, "What's wrong with him?" He says, "Well, he does not deserve you." I was frustrated. Something was going on that I did not know about, and she wasn't saying what it was. She says, "He's cheating on you, Mom." I say, "What?" She says, "Yes, his daughter told me. He's been sleeping with her mom." I was confused at first. What if his daughter was lying? What if she knew my daughter would tell me and was trying to upset our relationship? It didn't seem like something she would do though. She's a sweet teenager, and I would often wish my daughter would behave just like her. I was shaken because it all started to make sense why my ex never wanted to talk about his ex-wife. He would simply say she left him for another dude and that was it. The late night works at the office and the nights he didn't return home all started to come back to me. I must have looked like I was going to faint because my daughter pulled up a chair immediately so I could sit. She says, "I didn't want to tell you because I knew you would be hurt." When I confronted him about it, he admitted it and I say, "You spoke to him?" I was shocked. All of this has been happening around me and I didn't notice. I was too wrapped up in my whirlwind romance that I didn't even pay attention to the signs. I felt really ashamed. It happened that my daughter had confronted him about his cheating and he'd told her to go ahead and tell me if she wanted to see me hurt. My daughter had held back on telling me because she knew I was happier and did not want to ruin my happiness. I was livid. This man was not just cheating, but he was also manipulating my daughter into not telling me. I could not believe that my daughter had kept all of that and had to live with that secret for months. She started to cry and I cried too. I decided though that it was the end of the road for my ex and me. I definitely had to leave him, but I couldn't do that immediately. I had to get an apartment for my daughter and me. It was really hard to not confront him about it. I watched him walk around the house, fighting the urge to confront him about his wickedness. My coworker and I would go out to look at houses together, and we eventually found a good apartment that we could rent. It was bigger than our former apartment, and we loved it, so I decided to take it. We needed money for furniture and other stuff that we would need in the house, so I carefully hatched a plan to steal my ex's credit card. The perfect opportunity came 2 weeks later when my ex's daughter informed my daughter about her parents going away during the week. My daughter and I were excited and started to plan towards moving to our apartment. My ex casually mentioned that he was going for a program in New York City. I knew immediately that he was going to be with his ex-wife, but I played the good girlfriend and helped him prepare for his trip. The night before, we talked about finances, and I managed to bring up his credit limit, and he revealed all that I needed to know, oblivious to the fact that his credit card was tucked away in my purse for use. The next day, I called in sick at work, and my daughter skipped school. We hurriedly packed our stuff and had a U-Haul come for them. My ex-boyfriend knew nothing about our plans. Of course, he was in New York attending his meeting. We planned a day out together, but not before I switched off my cell phone so he couldn't contact me about whatever might happen with his credit card. My daughter and I went to the mall and got our manicure and pedicure, new furniture for our apartment, cosmetics, and some new clothes. My daughter and I had a fun day shopping before leaving for our apartment. I turned on my phone later that night and I got tons of messages from my ex-boyfriend, all of which I ignored. He'll figure it out on his own why I did what I did. Today, my 15-year-old daughter and I stay in our rented apartment. We have a better relationship now and I'm glad. Surprisingly, my ex never tried to contact me about his credit card or why I moved out after that day, and I preferred it that way. I still look at the furniture in my living room and smile to myself. I'm not gonna lie, my mind's just kind of blown that they never did anything involving their credit card. Like, surely OP spent hundreds of dollars and they just let it go? Maybe the credit card company just refunded them because it was clearly fraudulent? I don't know. You would think that there would be some real ramifications, but hey, you got out of there and you got some sweet stuff too. Is twin trouble. I'm a 27-year-old female and I have a twin sister. We're identical twins who were born exactly 13 seconds after each other. She always says it counts, but I don't think it does. So we've pretty much been attached to the hip from birth. Before we were even born, the scan showed us as one child, with one synchronized heartbeat and one of each body part. You can imagine the shock when my mother started to push and birthed 2 girls instead of 1. She used to joke that we were one soul divided into 2 people, and we genuinely did believe it. Both of our first names start with M, so we've always been called M&M, like the chocolate, by family and friends. It started when we got into kindergarten and continued through elementary and high school. We were never apart for long because I couldn't function without her, and she didn't speak to anyone unless I was around. My mother used to always say that it was much harder to tell us apart when we were little because we were born tricksters. We would answer each other's names and exchange clothes when she wasn't watching, just so she wouldn't realize who was who. Of course, she was our mother, so she knew, but every now and then she would play along just to entertain us. Besides our parents, no one else could tell us apart. We were dark-haired, green-eyed girls who spoke in a language that no one else could understand. My twin sister and I were so inseparable that we never left each other's side. We slept in the same beds, walked together everywhere, and we even fell sick together. If I broke my arm, my sister felt the pain just as intensely as I did, and vice versa. I knew what she was thinking because it was what I thought about too, and we always completed each other's sentences. Up until high school, people could barely tell us apart. We dressed identical, sat beside each other all the time, and just when a teacher or a classmate thought they'd figured us out, we'd trick them by pretending to be each other. Having a twin was amazing because it felt like having 2 of myself. In our senior year, my sister had a crush on a boy. It felt strange because it was the first time both of us had ever had an emotion that wasn't collective to us both, and I was livid. I tried to disrupt her emotions as much as I could, but my sister was a little more strong-willed than me, so she didn't listen to me. After talking to my mother about the situation, she advised me to allow my sister to live her life, because as much as it felt like we were the same person, we really were not. In order to allow my sister to be happy with her now boyfriend, I began to dress differently from her. Not so much that it was painfully obvious to everyone, but enough that he could tell us apart. I felt like a third wheel, going everywhere with my sister and her boyfriend, so I also started to detach. This meant that I spent less time with my twin sister and more time alone. It felt similar to heartbreak, what I felt after we drifted apart, but at least it made more room for me to make other friends. I soon became close with the girl that would become my second best friend. Let's call her Z. It wasn't the same as having my sister around me, but Z was a really good friend, and I enjoyed having her around. It was even better that she planned to go to the same college as my sister and I, so I knew that we would be friends for a while. Z and I got so close that I stopped feeling like such a bother to my sister, but it also meant that I didn't notice when my sister and her boyfriend went through a breakup. I found out 2 weeks after it happened because our mother casually said it at dinner, and I felt so hurt that my sister hadn't told me. That was the first big fight that we had, and she made it seem like it was all my fault for not paying any attention to her. We didn't speak to each other for 2 weeks, only starting to talk again because our mother threatened us with a week of staying alone at home while she and our father went on a road trip. My twin sister and I talked it out, cried it out, and soon we were closer than ever. It became my sister and me and Z. We were an unstoppable trio, and even became roommates in college. I finally felt complete and happy. In college, my twin and I resumed being tricksters, attending classes in place of each other and dressing identical so that we could scare people into thinking we were just one person. It worked on a lot of people, as usual, until I decided that I wanted to dye my hair. My sister was against it, but when I suggested it, she also refused to dye her own hair to match mine. I tried to convince her, but she was adamant that we didn't need to dye our hair at all. I thought that if I dyed mine first, she would feel a little more comfortable and then dye hers. But her reaction was the very opposite of that. She completely freaked out and went berserk, calling me a traitor and stomping out of our dorm room. Something changed in my sister after that incident. I did not know what it was, but she became wilder and didn't care about school anymore. I had to get a wig that was similar to her hair so I could take some of her tests and exams for her when she was too hungover to even open her eyes. In our sophomore year of college, she started to date another guy that I could just tell was bad news. He was the stereotypical bad boy type, always wearing leather jackets, used too much gel in his hair, and rode a bike. But he was also a terrible person. He drank, smoked, and partied a lot. He was also very promiscuous, got into a lot of fights, and made trouble everywhere he went. It wasn't like we didn't attend the occasional party, but for the most part, my sister and I were introverts. Or so I thought. Suddenly, my twin had invites to every party in town. We attended a college in Los Angeles, California, so there was always a party to attend. She dressed up nearly every weeknight and came back either drunk or high out of her mind. I tried to advise her against her new lifestyle, but she only threw it in my face that if I could dye my hair when she didn't want me to, then she could do whatever she wanted, whether I approved of it or not. Eventually, I figured out that my sister wouldn't listen to me, so I prepared myself to face her boyfriend. He was very cunning and good at lying, and I was so desperate to save my sister from him that I didn't realize that he was roping me in too. The only downside to having a twin with similar tastes in nearly everything was the fact that we liked the same kind of men, for the most part. I didn't want to fall for my sister's boyfriend, but I did, and I fell hard. I tried to stay away from him, but he brought himself to me all the time, dropping by our dorm room and pretending to look for my sister, or even coming into our lecture halls to wait for her when he knew that she wasn't present in the class. I confided in Z, and she advised me to talk to my sister about it, which I planned to, but my sister's boyfriend had other plans. He called me out one night to confess his feelings to me, telling me how much he wanted both my sister and me to be bus girlfriends. I thought he was delusional, so I cussed him out for it and tried to walk away, but he suddenly grabbed me and kissed me. He was much stronger than me, so even as I struggled to push him off of me, it didn't work. Unfortunately, this happened right in front of our dorm room, and my sister had just stepped out of the room, all dressed up for a date with the same jerk. I would later find out that all of it was a carefully planned scheme for him to get my sister even further away from me. When he spotted my twin sister, he pushed me away from himself and wiped a hand across his mouth, accusing me of kissing him. I was too stunned to speak because my sister was there, and when I tried to explain, she called me names and then grabbed his hand and walked away. After then, I didn't see my sister for nearly a week, and she refused to pick up my calls or answer my texts. The only time she came back to the dorm was to pick up some clothes and to tell Z that she would be staying temporarily with her boyfriend. I cried to Z, but I knew that the only thing I could do was to prove to my sister that her boyfriend was just like a jerk and he was using us as his own personal jesters. Towards the middle of junior year, the jerk began to message me again, asking to see me and continually flirting. I had the good mind to block him, but Z advised me not to. Instead, I stored all of his texts as evidence, so when my sister and I were able to see each other and speak again, I'd be able to show her that she was wrong to believe a man over her own twin sister. The jerk continued to text me and beg to meet up with me, and when I didn't indulge him, he started to talk crap about my sister. He would send me messages about how she was a terrible girlfriend, and that he would leave her for me in a heartbeat if I would agree to be his girlfriend again. I'll spare you the rest of the details, but believe me, it only got worse from there. With Z's help, I found other girls that he was also talking to at the same time, and I compiled all of the evidence into one big file. For the first time in almost a year, my sister and I went home for Thanksgiving. She avoided me for a couple of days, but I wasn't worried because I knew what I had to do. I sent the evidence to her email with a fake email address that I created, and I left her to read it. She was very moody and quiet all through dinner, so I knew that my plan had worked. Later that night, while I slept in the guest room, she came in to speak to me. She asked if I was the one who sent the email, and after I came clean to her, she broke down in tears. I couldn't help but cry too when my sister apologized for choosing a lying and cheating man over me, and we hugged it out. She also apologized to me for also being fussy about me dyeing my hair. She just didn't want us to drift apart the way we did in high school. My twin then confided in me that her ex had started to hit her at a point. He also tried to introduce other illegal substances to her since she already drank alcohol, and that was where she began to be suspicious, but she didn't know how to leave him. We spent the rest of the night talking and catching up on almost a year's worth of things that we missed out on. My sister suggested revenge to me, and I have to be honest that I was very scared. What if he found a way to get back at us for it? She assured me that he had so many enemies because of how much of a jerk he was, so I agreed to plan his downfall with her. As I mentioned earlier, my sister is a very strong-willed person, and she fortunately was not scared of a lot of things. She suggested that we report her now ex-boyfriend to the authorities for possessing drugs and illegal substances. I thought she was going too far, so on a second thought, she decided to alert some loan sharks that he'd been running from for a while. Me, her, and Z showed up to the door of the loan shark, and she let him know that her ex-boyfriend was a jerk, so she would let him, the loan shark, in on his whereabouts if he promised that he would beat him up for her. The man gruffly agreed and slammed the door in our faces after we'd given him the details he needed. We were frightened out of our minds, but we were very proud of our accomplishments. About 2 weeks later, we heard that my sister's ex had landed in the hospital after being attacked mercilessly. As if that wasn't enough trouble, we also found out that he'd gotten 2 girls and a female professor pregnant. My sister and I graduated from college with really good grades, and 2 years ago, we got married on the same weekend to 2 amazing men that cherished familial relationships over all else. My sister's jerk ex is a single dad to 3 kids, and maybe he's a changed man now. Could you imagine sleeping around left and right like this guy did, and then finding out you got not 1 but 2 different girls pregnant, including one of them being a professor? That dude made some dumb decisions because his life was screwed at that point. I don't think they learned their lesson, at least not for a while, because they ended up with 3 kids apparently. Do you guys think it's possible for a guy like this at some point in their life to finally change and mature? Or if they're doing all this by the time they get in college and even afterwards, do you think they're almost guaranteed to be a lost hope? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And our final story of the day is best friend doesn't respect the don't date your ex's rule. This is how I got back at my best friend for sneaking around with my ex-girlfriend behind my back. Now, this happened just after my senior year in high school a few years ago. I had just finished my final exams, and my aunt invited my cousin and I to go on a short trip to Paris with her when my ex-girlfriend sent a text breaking up with me. I had just had lunch in a great restaurant with my rich actress aunt, and I was so bothered that I threw up when we got back to the hotel. My aunt and cousin tried to cheer me up, but I was really sad and lacked the motivation to go out and participate in any of the fun activities. That text ruined the trip for me. What was supposed to be a fun trip for us three turned out to be the two ladies consoling and trying to get me to even step out of my hotel room. I would say that I didn't see that coming, but I did. She acted strange the whole of our final semester, and I knew something was wrong, but when I did ask her, she said she was just really bummed about her parents finalizing their divorce. She had told me, my mom, and anyone who cared to listen that she was excited about her parents divorcing when they announced to her that they were getting a divorce because they fought too much and she thinks they're much better apart. So I knew the talk about her parents' divorce was an excuse. I, however, tried not to push further or bother her, and instead tried to be there for her and be a support for her as much as I could. Funnily, this seemed to irritate her even more. My ex-girlfriend would yell at me and roll her eyes at me, but I ignored her attitude and refused to be mad about it. One day I decided I'd had enough. I put my foot down and insisted that I will not tolerate her disrespectful behavior. She cried and apologized. She told me she was stressed out thinking about college, the future, and having to shuffle between her mom's house and her dad's. The next day, she came over to say goodbye to me before my aunt, cousin, and I left for the airport, and we hugged. I whispered an apology about the argument we had the night before. She admitted that I was right to have refused to tolerate her excesses, apologized again, and kissed me. It was all so sweet to anyone who was watching, but I was unsettled. Something just was not right, and it felt like she was kissing me goodbye. Yes, she was doing that because I was going to be away for 2 weeks, but it felt final. I wasn't shocked that she broke up with me, but breaking up with me via text and doing it while I was away on a vacation in Paris was just mean. I was supposed to be in Paris having a great time and resting after working so hard to ace my final exams. I refused to accept that it was over and decided I would talk to her when I returned home and we would figure it out and maybe make up. I just figured something was wrong somewhere. There was something she wasn't telling me and she would probably just say it when I confronted her and we would kiss about it and move on. Well, she didn't even let me speak to her when I tried to. First, I texted her to let her know I was back, but she read and didn't reply to my text. So I went to her mom's house where they all used to live. I'm going off to college anyway. It's best to break up now since we may have to do it later, she said before I could even say anything. I was hurt all over. I knew then that she wasn't going to change her mind, so I just said okay and left for my best friend's home. I decided to visit my best friend so we'd play video games together and I can get my mind off things. That was not the first time my ex-girlfriend and I would break up, though it did seem like the last time. We've broken up in the past, and my best friends helped me get out of my sad spell when we played video games together with my little brother in his house. He didn't even know I was back from my trip yet. When I saw him at the door, he didn't appear to be happy to see me and he looked a bit nervous. I told him there that my ex-girlfriend had broken up with me. He didn't look surprised at all, just nodded and let me in. Did she tell you why? He asked nervously. I told him about everything that had happened between us, how she'd been acting up, and I blamed it on her parents' divorce, and the night I called her out on her constantly disrespectful attitude, and how she kissed me before I left for the airport. In hindsight, I should have noticed that he cringed when I mentioned that she kissed me, but of course, I didn't pay much attention to his facial expression at the time, or the fact that he expressed no surprise about us breaking up. I was hurt, and all I cared about was expressing my pain to my best friend. We didn't end up playing video games because I was heartbroken. I kept wondering aloud about why she ended things with me. We've had our issues in the past, but we've always been able to move on from them, and it only strengthened our relationship. Even when we did break up before, we got back together after almost 3 weeks. But this time, the way she ended things was so cruel, and I didn't even know she was capable of being so mean and cold-hearted. I spent my time in my best friend's home reading a book I found on the kitchen counter. His beloved dog, a beautiful golden retriever, sat close to me as I read. My best friend's had his dog for 2 years, and he loved her to pieces. She was an answer to his longtime prayer. He always wanted a dog, but his mom said no, and his dad just went along with whatever his mom said. He kept pressuring his parents to let him adopt one, but his mom insisted. He had to prove that he would be responsible with his dog and do well academically before his mom finally said she would consider it. On the day he got lucky, his dad brought home his dog and presented it to him. It was some months after his 16th birthday. My best friend was over the moon with excitement, and he invited me over to look at her. She was a beautiful little pup, and I was excited for him. He spent most of his time with her, and she enjoys being in his company too. I visit my best friend often, and he visits me with his dog, so she was quite familiar with me too. She's generally a lovable and charming dog. Even strangers love her, and would try to pet her and buy her treats when he walked her on the streets. Anyway, enough about the dog. My best friend suddenly stopped visiting me. Ever since I returned from Paris, he never came over, and I didn't understand why until I had a conversation with my little brother one evening. That evening, I was writing a song in my room when my brother came in to ask how I was holding up. To be honest, I was over it and was just looking forward to leaving for college and visiting my aunt in LA before that. I had my plate full and had lots of dreams for myself. I told him this and he sighed. Honestly, I would be devastated if my best friend did that to me, man. Best friend? What? I didn't understand what my brother was talking about, so I just assumed he meant girlfriend. Oh, it's fine. Who knows? We would have just broken up when we both leave for college anyway. He says, I understand, but to leave you for your best friend? That must really suck, and you're a much stronger man than I am. Now I was lost. Best friend? I asked my brother in shock. My brother then told me that my ex and my best friend started going out while I was away in Paris. I could not believe my ears. He thought I knew already. He'd almost gotten into a fist fight with my best friend when he found out and warned him to never show his face in our house until he confessed to me. He preferred that my best friend break the news to me himself. Now it became very clear why my best friend was avoiding coming over to my house. Even when I visited him, he hardly said anything to me about the end of my relationship. He only just asked if my ex-girlfriend told me why. My brother felt very bad for me and he apologized for my finding out in that manner. I was no longer hurt though. I was just really angry. To think I rushed to him when I returned to tell him about how hurt I was and he knew why she ended it, but said nothing. I decided to get my pound of flesh, but I was undecided as to how to go about it. The next day, I texted him and told him I know why he's been avoiding me and asked why he didn't tell me earlier that he and my ex-girlfriend were together. I'm sorry, he texted back. I didn't have the heart to tell you. I knew you'd be pissed. We didn't mean to hurt you and have been into each other for a while now. They'd been sneaking around behind my back even when we were still together. I was pissed. I told him it was fine, and he thanked me and expressed hope that things won't be awkward between us. That was funny. Things will certainly be awkward between us. I was to leave for LA soon, so I carefully hatched my revenge plan. I decided I was going to take his dog from him. Yes, he deserves that. We've been best friends all through high school. I always had his back, and he did that to me? He knew how much I loved my ex-girlfriend. She meant the world to me. And he knew how terrible I felt when we first broke up. Yet he had no problem becoming the reason we break up again. Not only did he sneak around with her while she was my girlfriend, they officially started dating and posting pictures on MySpace just after we spoke about it. It was like they were waiting for me to find out so they could finally show themselves to the world. I also could not help but wonder how many people knew. I mean, my brother found out before me. Other people in school and in our neighborhood probably knew too. My best friend made a fool out of me, and I was desperate to get back at him. The first thing I did was convince my aunt to pay extra for my flight tickets. Since I was going to be traveling with a dog, I needed the money. I told her I'd adopted a dog and added that it was because I'd started to feel lonely after the breakup, so she wouldn't ask any more questions, and she agreed. The day before my flight's date, I texted my best friend about visiting him that evening, and he seemed elated about it. I need to beat you one last time, I wrote in my text, referring to the karate video game we played together. He asked if I was coming with my brother. I said I wasn't, but I had planned with my brother to pick me up later. Things were indeed awkward between us until we started to play and things eased up. I even started to feel bad about what I was going to do, but I was not going to back down. Never. His dog was being all cute and funny as usual, and I suddenly could not wait for her to be mine. My best friend was in the kitchen when my brother texted to inform me that he was around. I asked him to come over to the window and passed him the dog. Luckily, she did not resist. I went into the kitchen and told him I had to leave and that my brother was around. He was reluctant to come out with me because he and my brother were not on good terms, and I took good advantage of this and dashed out. While we drove away, I saw my ex-girlfriend driving to his house. I was glad because this meant my best friend would be distracted and may not notice his dog was gone for a while. She started to bark, but we were no longer close to his house. Really? His dog? That is petty, my brother exclaimed. I waved him off and said nothing. Nobody could decide for me how to react to what my best friend had done. Before we got into the house, I made my brother promise not to tell our mom what we had done. The next morning, I was to leave for my flight. I'd switched off my phone so my best friend would be unable to reach me should he suspect that I left with his dog. But when I turned it on, I saw I had no messages from him. He most likely hadn't even noticed that his dog wasn't in the house. Perhaps my ex-girlfriend slept over and he was too distracted. The thought pissed me off even more, and my mind was made up. My best friend's dog was going with me to LA. My mom saw the dog and frowned. "Isn't that your friend's dog?" she quizzed. I say, "Well, he gave her to me." She says, "He gave you his dog?" "Yes," my brother and I chorused. "I do not understand boys," she said and started the car. I had just landed at the airport in LA when my brother called to say my best friend came over to our house to see me. He asked my brother if he had seen the dog, and of course, my brother curtly told him no. He texted me, but I never even bothered to read his texts before deleting them. The next day, he and my ex-girlfriend were sharing printed copies of the dog, asking everyone in the neighborhood if they had seen her. I knew he'd be hurt. He loved his dog and she loved him too, but that was exactly the reaction I wanted. To save him the trouble of searching, I sent a picture of the dog in my aunt's apartment to him. I had a hard time with her at first since she wasn't used to the environment, but she eventually warmed up to me and became my new best friend. He cursed at me, but I didn't care. I had gotten my revenge and it was a sweet feeling. On one hand, yay, a new dog. On one hand, I am depressed that that guy lost his dog. And somehow on another third hand, I'm really wondering why there wasn't any kind of law enforcement or legal thing going on here. Even though it's probably cross country, I feel like if you can identify that it's your dog that was stolen and you can tell where they are, you should be able to do something about it, right? I'm just surprised that it seems like the best friend gave up on getting their dog back. I took the kids and got away from my wife. Nobody enjoys high finance. The pressure is astronomical. The hours are long and, quite frankly, it's dull. That's why when my wife fell pregnant with our son, I decided to look for a new career. I wanted to be a part of my son's life and do a fair share as a parent, but that was never going to happen as things stood. Time wasn't too much of an issue. We had enough savings to tie us over whilst I retrained for a new career. So long as we scaled back on the organic chicken and foreign holidays, we'd be fine. What I really wanted to do was work in the police force. The training at Hendon would only take a few months and I'd be fulfilling a dream. However, I was put off by the pay and the unsocial hours, so I had to strike that idea and move on. In the end, I decided that I should put my mathematical talents to use and retrained as a data analyst. I discussed it with my wife Sarah and asked her if she would be okay with the somewhat tighter purse strings. She said she more than understood. The financial sacrifices were more than offset by the ability to be a proper family. I was heartened by her response, though not much surprised. She lived for the chance to have what she'd missed in her early years. You see, my wife had been a care home kid. Her mother had been a teenager squatting in a council flat when she fell pregnant with Sarah and, what's more, an addict. When she was born, Sarah suffered from what's called neonatal abstinence, which is when the baby is exposed to drugs in the womb and subsequently suffers withdrawal. Her mother abandoned her and left her in the state's care, which led to a tumultuous childhood. She drifted to and fro from care home to foster family, never enjoying a sense of stability. It was the common story. She became a dysfunctional teenager whose life started to spin out of control. She got into fights, dabbled in drugs, committed petty crimes. At the 11th hour when she was 16, she found a foster couple who were experienced in dealing with problematic kids. They treated her with a great deal of kindness, patience, and understanding. That couple were my biological parents. I was able to watch as, little by little, Sarah's life started to turn around. Her character changed too. When she first arrived on our doorstep, greasy-haired and sullen, she quickly established herself as the resident hard butt. You couldn't talk to her, let alone do anything for her. As she settled in and began trusting us though, she opened up and revealed a beautiful personality. She never lost a certain edge, but it ceased to feel standoffish, if you know what I mean. It was when I'd come home from Christmas during my first year of university that something sparked between me and her. We were a little apprehensive about telling my parents, but we needn't have been. They were as understanding as ever. Well, I suppose even though it was a bit more complicated, it wasn't really sibling stuff, was it? We had some great times in those first few years. One evening, we had a date night at an Italian restaurant when a large, noisy rabble came bustling through and took up a large table not far from our own. At first, we exchanged looks of trepidation, but in time, found it wasn't nearly so bad. In fact, from our point of view, it was a pretty funny night. A little while after they got sat down, a nervous young woman arrived and joined them. As it turns out, it was a first date. The fella had brought along his whole family. Talk about outnumbered. They were an outspoken lot and didn't seem to have any kind of self-awareness. The father of the group started lecturing her about the dangers of the government and warned that the British one would follow America's suit and start killing off people. Then he asked his wife to pull out her iPad and lend it to him. She obliged, and before we all knew it, we were treated to Alex Jones on full volume, saying that the American Air Force had flooded Texas and killed dozens of people. I've met a few people like them before, and I don't think they mean any real harm. They're just a bit thick. The first couple of married years leading up to my career change were great too. We were upwardly mobile, had settled into a nice home, and were very fortunate. It was so idyllic that it seemed too good to be true. Our son Tommy was born, and by that point I'd settled into my new career as a data analyst for a recruitment agency. Then my wife fell pregnant again. That complicated matters more than we realized, as the second child was born with moderately severe autism. Between the mortgage, the cost of 2 kids, and the extra cost of supporting a disabled child, our finances became a whole lot tighter. Amidst the resulting pressure, the hidden secret in our relationship popped out of the darkness. Sarah was an alcoholic. I found a bottle of wine hidden at the bottom of our wardrobe. At the time, I thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it. It was only when I later found 2 more bottles of hidden alcohol elsewhere that my suspicions were raised. She started flaking out in her commitments, regularly popped paracetamols, and her whole demeanor changed. It was like she didn't care about anything. I spent a couple of weeks figuring out how on earth I was going to address this. My job was made a whole lot easier when, one evening, Sarah came in with sour face. On her way home from work, the police had pulled her over. She told me with an outraged tone that she'd been forced to take a breathalyzer and failed it. Insisted that it must be a mistake, that she'd barely had a lick of alcohol and that she felt perfectly in control. They escorted her to the station where she failed another test. She'd been charged with drunk driving. I thought that this was as good a time as any to address the situation. I decided that not sounding judgmental or harsh was the way to go, that I needed to be tactful. So after I heard her out, I started with an easy question. Are you okay? Well, she bit my head off. Of course she wasn't. She'd just been humiliated. How could I be so stupid, she said. That wound me up a bit. Here was me trying to show concern and be gentle, and she just hurls insults at me. I lost myself a bit and bluntly asked, "Why are you hiding booze?" She looked at me with indignation. She asked why I was accusing her of drink driving and said that, for the record, she wasn't hiding anything. If there were a bottle or 2 lurking around, they just got left during tidy-ups. I guffawed, asking how on earth a bottle of brandy could find itself in the cistern during a tidy-up. Her eyes were like daggers after I said that, and then she walked out. I really didn't want to leave her. I loved her more than life itself. but over the next few weeks I felt so stuck. Our discussion had driven our relationship into a wall, and we were trapped there. Any attempts to make amends were shrugged off. By this point, I should note that both kids were getting to an age where they were compos mentis, so that was always an extra worry. One evening, when they were staying with my parents, I broached the subject once more. I said, "Look, I'm not judging, it's just that I care about you. I don't want you to struggle alone." Now it was her turn to laugh. She said that she'd spent most of her formative years alone and did just fine. I asked her what she meant, and she just shrugged that off too. The real turning point came a couple of months down the line. By this point, barely a happy word was exchanged, save for when the kids were around, during which times it was all smiles and hugs. Through gritted teeth anyway. Sarah's condition was also noticeably further deteriorating. People were beginning to notice something was wrong. We got invited to a dinner party by the parent of one of Tommy's friends. Everything started out quite well, to the point that I was starting to relax. But then, come the main course, Sarah's starting to get carried away with the wine. She starts making inappropriate comments and embarrassing herself. Nobody knew where to put their face, least of all me. I feigned an emergency and got us out of there before she could really turn it into a disaster. The very worst event came a little further down the line though, parents' evening. That night at our children's infant school turned out to be humiliating. Sarah said to bring the kids and that she'd meet me there. She promised me that she'd be sober. When she walked into the classroom, it was immediately clear that she was at least merry. She wasn't there more than 2 minutes when she started throwing herself at some of the dads, all who looked mortified, and tripped over the chairs before eventually finding her way to us. I was livid. I just wanted to grab and shake her. It wasn't just about me either, it was the kids she'd really let down. As soon as it was over, I got the kids in the car and pulled her aside to discreetly but assertively voice my disgust. She acted like it was no big deal, told me to lighten up. I was ready to wash my hands of her. She didn't come home that evening, and in that moment, still stewing, I didn't really want her to do so. In the wee hours, there was a knock at the door. It was the police. My wife had been in an accident. Was it serious? She was alive but had been taken to the hospital. I got the kids up and drove them to their grandparents, who agreed to look after them whilst I went off to the hospital. When I got there, I found that she looked pretty battered up. She had bruises all over her face. It turned out that she'd broken a couple of ribs, but was, despite appearances, mostly fine. Sarah broke when she saw me. She said that she felt so embarrassed and horrible, that she would never take us or her life for granted again. Her tears were the most genuine display I'd seen from her in ages. Any lingering frustration melted away. I said that I'd support her. She said that she would get help. When the family learned of the situation, my Aunt Shelley insisted on coming to stay to help out with the kids and around the house. Well, that's just brilliant, I thought. I had nothing against her really, it's just that she was a batty old mare that had made Anne Whitcomb look like a fetus. She was never the most switched-on person, but old age made a total dope of her. The first evening that she stayed, I slipped into the living room to say I was going to nip out for a bulb, since the one in the hall had blown, when she chimes in and says, "Wait a minute." She picked up her handbag, rummaged through it, and pulled out an energy-saving bulb. She waved it at me and said, "Would this do?" As if being a mobile DIY store was the most normal thing in the world. And yet, that wasn't nearly the most bizarre thing she did. What really brought home my position was when she called me into the kitchen one night to complain about my whisk. I couldn't believe what I saw. It defied belief. Made half of me want to call the asylum, and the other half descend into outrageous laughter. She was standing over the counter holding a bowl of cream, and I watched it jiggling as she whisked it, with my wife's purple you-know-what. The absurdity of the situation was evidently lost on her, as she bannily complained about this modern rubbish. I was sharing a house with an alcoholic invalid and an old woman who used toys as kitchen utensils. How I didn't go crazy, I'll never know. Things did pick up, however, for a while. Sarah healed nicely and showed genuine commitment to keeping off the drink. She steadily but slowly reverted back to the woman and mother that I loved. For the next couple of years, we enjoyed a sunny period. As George Harrison said, though, all things must pass. I knew it was bad news when one of her old friends from her care home days rocked up at our door. I tried to reserve judgment, but it was clear from the off that she was a bad sort. A ratty, skanky sort of woman. She looked every bit as messy and dangerous as she turned out to be. Sarah wanted Jackie to stay for a while, but I didn't really want her around at all. Out of kindness, though, I compromised and said she could stay a couple of nights. Jackie was really grateful. I was such a nice and kind bloke, she said. She told Sarah that she could see why she'd married me. I did Britain proud by giving her that ever so polite smile we give to people we don't like. A couple of days turned into a week into 2. I tried to politely inquire about her plans. I tried to gently push Sarah into asking her to leave. I didn't want to pressure her too much. I knew that pressure had driven her to booze. But I didn't want that woman around my kids for a moment longer than necessary. More time passed. I saw the warning signs quicker this time. It looked very much like Sarah was back to drinking. I reassured her that if she ever needed a talk, a helping hand, whatever, I was there for her. She smiled innocently and said I was sweet. In the meantime, I went hunting for bottles but came up with nothing. She must have gotten much smarter about her hiding places. As it happened though, the truth was much worse. I came home from work late one evening to find my wife and her friend crouched over the coffee table. They were doing lines. I thought of the kids sleeping upstairs and lost my temper. I grabbed Jackie's lank, ugly hair and dragged her out of the house kicking and screaming. Sarah followed all the while, tugging my jacket and shouting at me. I shoved Jackie onto the ground outside and told her to never set foot here again and that if she did, the police would be called. I grabbed Sarah by the arm and pulled her inside, shut the door, and proceeded to have a loud, nasty argument with her. It was escalating to the point that it risked getting out of hand. But then reason appeared in the form of little Tommy. His big brown eyes were crying from the top of the stairs, and that cut through the anger like a gentle machete. I relived Sarah's denial stage all over again. Yes, she said, I know I have a problem with alcohol, but this is different. She only did a bit now and again for a laugh. She had it completely under control. I said that's what she told herself about the booze. She shook her head. I delivered an ultimatum. Quit the drugs or I'm leaving. Naturally, she countered with, do that and you won't see the kids again. It's clear that she made her decision. Trouble was, she had me over a barrel. Custody was one of those areas where women had a major advantage over men. I couldn't even chance that they'd side with me because of her drink issue, as I've seen mothers do much worse and still get custody. So for the time being, I pulled back. She passed out on the sofa, and I went to bed. Sleep was impossible though. I chastised myself for having cleaned up after them. How careless. I couldn't go on like this though. She'd gone way too far, doing drugs with children in the house. The children. Every time I thought about them, my blood pressure rose. How could she do it to them? I couldn't, and still can't, understand that. I had to get rid of her one way or another. For the next couple of days, we all fell back into old patterns, playing happy families when the kids were around, not saying a word to each other when they weren't. It occurred to me at work that simply tossing that street rat out probably wouldn't stop Sarah from seeing her. She had an addictive personality after all, and Jackie could provide the fix. I scoured social media to find her but found nothing until I remembered one of the other girls that Sarah used to hang around with as a teenager. Through her profile, I found Jackie's surname, and then I moved on to getting her address. For a few quid, I was able to get it from another website, and so I took note on my phone and left it at that for the time being. There was still a part of me having doubts. I didn't really want to take the kids away from a parent, but how on earth could I navigate the issue otherwise? What really did it for me was a couple of weeks further down the line. I checked the app for our joint savings account and found a few $100 had vanished in the interim. That set me on panic mode. If I didn't act soon, we could all be up a creek without a paddle. I took a week off work. Officially, I was going to use the time to get some jobs around the house done. Really though, I wanted to see if Sarah would slip away at any point. She did, thrice, and each time I followed her. She had been honest about each one. They were all mundane tasks. By the time Friday rolled around, I was close to giving up. Then at the 11th hour, almost literally, she went out on the pretense of getting cereal for the morning. I perked up at this because, being pretty late, it was nothing short of odd. I left the kids with a trusted neighbor and got into my car, watching and following far behind as she walked over to the nearest council estate. There, she went to the exact address that I'd noted down weeks earlier. I sat in the car for about 10 minutes and then decided to steal a peek. I walked up to the house and through a slit between the curtains, I saw Sarah and that jerk all over each other. I felt sick. There they were in front of the sofa, practically eating each other. I didn't want to look for a moment more than necessary, but I came here for evidence, and I'd be darned if I was turning back now. What I needed was on the table though, coke. I got my phone out and took a picture of the scene. It was a sordid, awful photo, but dynamite nonetheless. Everything that she could be doing wrong, she was doing it. I drove to the police station, gave them the address and the photo, and then headed home. After I picked up the kids, I told them to pack their things and transferred all the money from our joint account into my personal one. She wasn't going to fritter away any more money on drugs. Besides, I needed as much money as possible to relocate and to pay potential legal fees. I had no intention of telling Sarah that I'd left or where we'd be going, but I wasn't going too far, just to the next closest town, little more than 15 miles away. There I rented a flat, and the following day, I began my application to the family court. In the meantime, Sarah texted and called relentlessly. With her messages climbing from incensed to deranged, she was out of control. The first hearing came just over a month later. My biggest fear was that Sarah might pull a rabbit out of the hat, that she might get herself together and find a golden ticket. I needn't have worried. In fact, I was gobsmacked when she turned up. She was a wreck. Greasy, disheveled hair, dead eyes, and a creased little dress. I had a funny feeling about all that. She must have pulled herself together enough to get legal aid, as she had a very young lawyer backing her. This set the pace for the whole proceedings, thankfully. I wasn't taking any chances though, so when that night I gave Jackie the bum's rush came up, I was a bit economical with the truth. I said that Jackie attacked me in a drug-fueled rage, and that's why there was so much fuss when getting her out. I denied pushing the table over, and said Sarah had done that in a fit of pique during our subsequent argument. I was going to do anything and everything to stop her from ever getting near the kids again. It worked. I had done enough, or rather Sarah had. Being a lying, cheating addict with anger issues was all it took to persuade the law that she couldn't be trusted with children. I got full custody. After that, my next move was to get a divorce from her. The day I signed the decree absolutely was the second happiest moment of the past year, only second to getting my kids. We stayed in the flat for a couple of years more, and then this year we moved into a nice little semi. The kids transferred to local schools and have subsequently been doing well, and just recently I've met someone new. It's early days, but I feel a connection to her that I've never known before. It's not all peaches and cream though. My parents, kind as they are, refused to wash their hands of Sarah. They said that as far as they were concerned, she was their daughter and they would fight for her. Understandably, this caused tension and issues and meant that I had to refuse to turn up to some family occasions. There was even a short few months where we didn't speak because they were trying to push me into handing over cash to them on Sarah's behalf. I told them no, she's not getting a penny out of me. She broke up our family and put the kids in danger. My parents initially were frustrated by my reaction and told me I was being unfair. I said that was ludicrous, that what she did was unfair. What I did was karma, and if it meant depriving her of coke, if it meant being able to provide for the kids, good. She put them through heck. They relayed to me the soul-crushing familiar cycle I'd lived, and so I had to listen as my parents' hopes would be raised again and again, only to be dashed each time. They threw money, love, and support at her, but it amounted to nothing. If anything, she just got worse. I told them time and time again, she'd long since given up. She doesn't want help. Anyone who's been around addiction knows that you can't fight for the addict if the addict won't fight for themselves. Sarah had become a full-blown, unrepentant drug user. She apparently had broadened her horizons. Heroin had become her new drug of choice, or it had, until her dying body was being transported by ambulance to A&E. She was gone on arrival. It was a heart attack that finished her. An unbelievable thing to happen to a woman in her 30s, but there we go. Dad went to the hospital alone, Mom couldn't face it, and told me how dismal she looked, spotty, gaunt, and wan, or hollowed out to use his phrasing. I didn't go to the funeral. My parents said that the funeral directors had done an admirable job of making her look less of a mess, said that she almost looked peaceful in the chapel of rest. Almost. Apparently it was a quiet affair. Mom, Dad, her old caseworker, and some well-wishers. I remember thinking that poor vicar had a tough job in his hands, having to try and find something nice to say about her. I decided to let the topic sit on the shelf when it came to the kids. They were so young, and I didn't want their progress derailed because of that sad excuse for a human being. When they're old enough, when they ask, I'll tell them about it. Until then, I refuse to let her poison trickle down into their young lives anymore. To be honest, I'd be happy if I never had to think about her ever again. I feel for OP because I can't imagine feeling like you gave everything you could to this person, and multiple times they just go against it, and then not only that but cheat on you as well. As painful as the end result was, do you think OP made the right decision by just cutting everything off and leaving them to their own devices? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. If you want to hear another crazy revenge story, make sure to hit that left video. Or if you missed my latest video, check out the one on the right. That said though, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.